My name is Esther Perez. I am 24 years old. 6 months ago, my grandfather stopped by my house for coffee and accidentally discovered the dark plum-colored bruises I had been hiding on my shoulder for 3 years. I broke down in tears, terrified, and confessed that my stepmother Nadine had put them there. I braced myself for the fallout. I expected him to march upstairs and confront her. Instead, my grandfather went perfectly still. He walked to the hall closet, picked up his battered leather briefcase, and told me to pack a bag. He said we were going to play her game, but by his rules. The next morning, when Nadine woke up to an empty house and picked up the phone to ruin my life, she had no idea she had just triggered her own financial undoing. Welcome back to Zara Told Stories, where quiet women keep the receipts and the endings are always earned. Before I take you back to the cold Iowa night that changed everything, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your age and your city in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the exact moment the peace broke. The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the coffee maker. It was late January in Des Moines, the kind of freezing Midwest night that makes the window panes rattle in their frames. I was reaching for a 40-pound bag of dog food on the top shelf of the walk-in pantry. As a veterinary technician, hauling heavy kibble was muscle memory. I did it 50 times a week at the clinic downtown. But my hands were numb that night. My grip slipped on the thick plastic. My oversized college sweatshirt swung forward, and the frayed collar caught hard on the sharp metal edge of the pantry latch. The fabric tore, dragging the thick fleece clean off my left shoulder. My grandfather, Hector, was standing at the Granite Island. He was just passing through town, stopping by for a late check-in. He turned his head at the sound of the tearing fabric. He froze. The skin across my collarbone and down my shoulder blade was a geographic map of trauma. Mustard yellow edges faded into dark plum-colored centers, stark against my pale winter skin. The handprint was unmistakable. Hector did not gasp. He did not drop his mug. He spent 35 years as a crop insurance adjuster traveling the Midwest. He knew how to assess a disaster without blinking. He stared at my shoulder the exact same way he used to survey 100 acres of hail-damaged corn. He was calculating the damage. He was looking for the point of impact. The silence in the kitchen stretched thick and suffocating. I tried to pull the sweatshirt back up, but my fingers were shaking too badly. The professional composure I relied on to calm terrified dogs and anxious pet owners all day shattered. I covered my face, and the tears I had swallowed for 3 years spilled over my palms. The truth tumbled out in fractured, panicked sentences. 2 days ago, the hallway upstairs, I had found a cardboard box of my late father Reuben's old files. Handwritten farming notes, old receipts, pieces of the man we lost suddenly 3 years prior. My stepmother Nadine had caught me holding it. She did not yell. She grabbed the box, shoved her hands hard against my chest, and pushed. I told Hector about the terrifying, weightless second at the top of the landing. The hard crack of the oak stairs against my spine. The way Nadine looked down at me from the top step, fixing her manicured nails, and told me to put the garbage back in the attic. Hector set his ceramic mug on the granite counter. The soft click echoed in the quiet room. He walked past me, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor, straight into the front hallway. From the closet, he retrieved his battered vintage leather briefcase. It was the same one he used to carry claim forms across county lines when I was a little girl. He set it down by the front door, then pulled an empty canvas duffel bag from the bottom shelf and tossed it at my feet. "Pack your things," he said. His voice sounded like dry gravel crunching under heavy tires. "You are staying with me. Tomorrow we play her game, but by my rules." I packed in 5 minutes. I did not take furniture or framed photos, just clothes, my work scrubs, and a toothbrush. I kept looking at the ceiling, waiting to hear footsteps. Upstairs, the floorboards remained dead silent. Nadine was fast asleep under a heavy down duvet, insulated by the quiet of a Des Moines winter night, oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere below her. We stepped out onto the porch. The icy Iowa air hit my lungs sharp and biting, but for the first time since my father died, I could breathe. Hector's diesel engine rumbled to life, sending plumes of white exhaust into the dark driveway. I climbed into the passenger seat, closed the door, and watched my childhood home shrink in the rearview mirror. Nadine slept on. She had no idea the house was empty. She had no idea that her reign of control had just collided with a man who kept every receipt, read every contract, and never lost an audit. By dawn, she would wake up, realize her punching bag was gone, and she would make her very first mistake. I woke up to the scent of percolating coffee and burning hickory wood. My grandfather's farmhouse sits on 20 acres of frozen Iowa soil, surrounded by fields that stretch out flat and white toward the horizon. It is a place built on practical silence, the kind of quiet that usually heals. I had placed my canvas duffel bag on the patchwork quilt of the spare bedroom the night before. Tucked deep inside that bag, beneath a stack of folded work scrubs, sat a small, faded velvet pouch. That pouch held the only physical items my biological mother left behind when she passed away during my childhood. A pearl necklace, a sapphire ring, and 2 gold bangles. For years, Nadine kept them locked inside a heavy steel safe in my father's house, claiming they were part of the general estate inventory. Taking them last night was not a theft. It was a rescue mission. But people like my stepmother do not surrender control gracefully. When they lose their grip on a target, they redefine reality to turn themselves into the victim. The crunch of heavy tires on frozen gravel broke the morning stillness. I looked out the frost-covered window, and my stomach plummeted. Flashing red and blue lights painted the snowbanks in harsh, strobe-like pulses. 2 sheriff cruisers sat idling in the driveway, their exhaust pluming into the bitter winter air. 2 deputies stepped out, resting their hands casually near their duty belts as they approached the porch. My throat went dry. I walked into the kitchen, my hands shaking so much I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. The phantom ache in my bruised shoulder flared up, a physical reminder of the woman who had sent these men. Hector was already at the front door. He held a ceramic mug in one hand, his face an unreadable mask. When he opened the door, the bitter wind swept into the house, carrying the harsh crackle of a police radio. The older deputy introduced himself, his tone strictly professional, scanning the room before his eyes landed. When he opened the door, the bitter wind swept into the house, carrying the harsh crackle of a police radio. The older deputy introduced himself, his tone strictly professional, scanning the room before his eyes landed on me. Nadine had not just dialed emergency services. She had performed for them. According to the dispatch report, she spun a frantic, tearful tale of a sudden, unprovoked assault. She claimed I pushed her, ransacked the master bedroom, and fled into the night with $50,000 worth of her personal heirloom jewelry. The sheer scale of the lie took my breath away. It was a calculated, devastating strike. If she could brand me a dangerous criminal, she could invalidate anything I said about the bruises hiding under my sweater. She wanted me in handcuffs before I had the chance to speak to anyone about the staircase. I stepped forward, ready to defend myself, my voice high and tight in my throat. But Hector raised one weathered hand, signaling me to stop. He opened the door wider and invited the deputies inside out of the freezing wind. He motioned toward the faded yellow formica table in the center of the kitchen. He poured 2 cups of black coffee from the glass carafe and slid them across the tabletop. The deputies exchanged a confused glance. They were expecting a chaotic domestic dispute, a defensive suspect, perhaps a shouting match. Instead, They encountered a retired farmer offering them warm mugs on a Sunday morning. Hector sat down, folded his hands over his knee, and asked them to outline the exact nature of the complaint. He listened without interrupting, his posture relaxed, absorbing the accusations like dry earth absorbing rain. When the younger deputy finished detailing the list of supposedly stolen items, Hector nodded slowly. He reached down to the floor beside his chair and lifted the vintage leather briefcase we had brought from the house hours earlier. The twin brass locks snapped open with a sharp metallic sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. He did not pull out a defensive argument. He pulled out a dark green, hard-bound ledger. The spine of the book was cracked with age. He slid it across the formica, opening it to a dog-eared page halfway through the stack of heavy paper. He explained that before he retired, he spent over 3 decades documenting property from major insurance firms, a habit that bled seamlessly into his personal life. The ledger contained a meticulous, itemized inventory of my late mother's personal effects, recorded shortly after her funeral. The pages held clear, dated photographs of the sapphire ring, the pearl necklace, and the gold bangles. Next to the photos were original purchase receipts, jeweler appraisals from 2 decades ago, and distinct serial numbers for the insurance riders. Clipped to the back of the page was a notarized copy of my mother's specific bequest. The legal document explicitly transferred ownership of those exact items to her daughter Esther Perez upon her 21st birthday. I am 24. The deputies leaned over the book. The older one traced a finger over the raised seal of the notary stamp. The tension in the room evaporated, instantly replaced by a heavy, awkward realization. They looked at the dates, the photographs, and the legal transfer of ownership. They had been dispatched as armed debt collectors for a bitter stepmother attempting to settle a family score. The older deputy sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He closed the ledger and pushed it back toward Hector. He apologized for the intrusion, his tone shifting from authoritative to weary. He explained that they were obligated to investigate the dispatch call, but it was abundantly clear this was a civil matter, and based on the ironclad documentation, no theft had occurred. He advised us to expect more harassment, noting that people who weaponize emergency lines for personal vendettas rarely stop at one attempt. As the officers zipped up their heavy winter coats and stepped back toward the front door, Hector walked them out. He leaned against the doorframe, watching the deputies step onto the frozen porch. His voice was casual, almost a passing thought, but I knew my grandfather never wasted breath on idle chatter. "You boys drive safe out there," Hector said. "And if your department talks to the county tax folks, you might want to mention that the IRS usually looks closer at widows who claim they have no income, but suddenly start paying cash for brand new Mercedes SUVs. The deputies paused, looking back at the old man with a new level of professional curiosity. A seed had been planted, small but undeniable. The cruiser backed out of the driveway a moment later, the flashing lights finally turning dark against the snow. I let out a long, shaky breath, slumping into a kitchen chair. I thought the worst was over. I thought the paper in that briefcase had just shielded me from the storm. But Hector closed the front door, turned the deadbolt, and looked at me with cold clarity. "Do not relax, Gracie," he said, carrying the coffee cups to the sink. "She tried to use the badge as a hammer and it broke. Now she will reach for a different tool." A sharp ping sounded from my coat pocket. My phone buzzed, vibrating against the fabric. It was an automated alert from my banking application. Then another ping sounded. Then a third. I pulled the screen up my stomach, twisting into a tight knot. The available balance on my primary checking account read 0. I swiped to the savings account. It held the exact same single digit. In the span of 60 seconds, every dollar I had earned at the veterinary clinic, every cent I had saved over the last 3 years, vanished into thin air. Nadine had found a back door, and the real war was just beginning. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. my thumb hovering over the banking application. The numbers refused to change. 0 in checking, 0 in savings. A cold wave washed over my ribs. The financial starvation was not a glitch. It was a calculated legal maneuver, rooted in a paradox my father unintentionally created before his heart gave out 3 years ago. Ruben Perez was a pragmatic Iowa farmer who trusted the soil more than he trusted banks. He also trusted his second wife. Before he passed, he filed a transfer on death deed for the 500 acres of prime agricultural land we lived on. That legal instrument bypassed the probate courts entirely. The dirt, the physical legacy of our family, transferred directly into my name. But the operational cash, the savings, the liquid assets required to actually run the property, were funneled into a sprawling family trust. Nadine was named the sole executor of that liquid trust. She controlled the water, and she was turning off the tap to watch me wither. I pressed the call button, listening to the automated bank menu, until a live representative picked up. I explained the situation, my voice trembling, asking why my personal accounts were locked. The representative typed for an agonizing minute. Her tone shifted into a practiced apologetic script. She explained that my accounts were historically linked to the overarching family trust structure. The executor had submitted a formal notice of erratic behavior and flight risk, triggering a temporary freeze on all outgoing transfers to protect the estate assets. Nadine had legally choked off my air supply. She knew I could not afford a lawyer to fight the freeze, and she knew I could not survive without cash. The strategy was brutally simple. Starr was desperate enough to sign a quitclaim deed handing over the 500 acres of dirt in exchange for my own money. I dropped the phone onto the Formica table. I had no money for gas. I had no money for groceries. The sheer weight of the trap pressed down on my lungs. Before I could even process the reality of being penniless, the phone buzzed against the tabletop. A text message lit up the screen. The sender was Britt, my stepsister. Britt moved through life with a relentless sense of entitlement, treating my father's farm like an ATM that printed endless weekend getaways and designer handbags. I tapped the notification. The message was long, dripping with unearned arrogance. She demanded $5,000 by Friday. She claimed she found the perfect commercial lease for a new boutique downtown and needed the deposit immediately. The second paragraph held the extortion. If I refused to transfer the funds, Britt warned her mother had already contacted a local scrap metal crew. They were scheduled to arrive at our main barn on Monday morning to haul away Ruben's vintage 1968 John Deere tractor. My breath hitched. That tractor was not just machinery. It was the rhythmic heartbeat of my childhood. I learned to drive on that cracked leather seat, smelling diesel fumes and crushed alfalfa. That green engine represented every early frost my father battled, every late harvest he brought in under the headlights. It was the physical symbol of our endurance. Nadine and Britt viewed it as heavy garbage they could melt down for a quick payday, holding it hostage to break my spirit. I pushed away from the table, pacing the length of the kitchen. Panic clouded my vision. I was cornered. I could not access a single dime to pay Britt, and I could not physically stop a scrap crew from pulling onto the property. The walls felt like they were shrinking, echoing the helplessness I endured upstairs in that house. Hector watched my erratic pacing. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me everything would be fine. He stood up, walked to his small home office down the hall, and returned carrying a yellow legal pad and 3 freshly sharpened wooden pencils. "Sit down, Gracie," he instructed, sliding into the wooden chair opposite mine. I sank into the seat, burying my face in my hands. "They are going to destroy his tractor," I whispered, the exhaustion bleeding into my syllables. "I cannot stop them. I have nothing." "You have the deed to the land," Hector replied, his tone even and unbothered. "And they have a spending problem. Let us look at the math." He began writing on the legal pad. The scratching of graphite against paper filled the room, steady and rhythmic. Hector possessed a mind built for audits. He asked me to list every known liquid asset the estate held on the day my father died. I recalled the life insurance policies, the farm operational accounts, the heavy machinery depreciation values. Hector wrote each number down, forming a neat column on the left side of the page. Then he drew a sharp vertical line down the center. Now, he said, looking over his reading glasses, "Tell me what Nadine has purchased since the funeral." I listed the visible expenses: the brand new luxury SUV sitting in the driveway, the endless stream of online shopping packages stacked by the front door, the expensive salon appointments, Brit's frequent trips to coastal cities, her high-end rental cars, the commercial leases that always seem to fail after 6 months. Hector jotted down estimated values for each item, building a second column on the right side of the paper. He tallied the numbers, his pencil moving with rapid precision. When he finished, he tapped the eraser against the pad. He turned the paper around so I could see the final calculation. The two columns did not match. They were not even close. "Nadine claims the estate is cash poor," Hector murmured, tracing the deficit with his finger. "She claims the maintenance costs are drowning her, which is why she needs you to sell the dirt. But look at this burn rate. A woman who has not punched a clock in 3 years cannot sustain this lifestyle on the trust you just described. The well should have run dry a year ago." I stared at the numbers, confusion cutting through the panic. "Where is she getting the cash?" "That is the right question," Hector said, a dangerous glint appearing in his dark eyes. "She is pulling capital from a hidden source, and she is terrified you will look close enough to find it. The bank freeze is not just a starvation tactic, it is a distraction. She wants you focused on your empty checking account so you do not ask questions about the ledger." The realization settled over me, cold and clarifying. The extortion over the tractor, the sudden freeze, the frantic police call, none of it was born from strength, it was all born from desperation. Nadine was running out of time to cover her tracks. But starving a person out is a slow game, and Nadine lacked patience. Her ego demanded immediate compliance. She needed me back in the house under her thumb, where she could monitor my every move and force the quitclaim signature through sheer intimidation. Hiding behind a bank freeze would not satisfy her need for control. She needed a stage. She needed an audience to validate her false narrative. Hector tore the page from the legal pad and folded it into a neat square, tucking it into his shirt pocket. He looked out the window at the rising sun, the Iowa sky turning a pale, bruised purple. "She knows you have a shift tomorrow morning," Hector said. "She knows you care about your job. She will not wait for you to surrender. She is going to come hunting." He was right. By Monday morning, Nadine would decide that financial pressure was not enough. She would attempt to drag me out into the open, orchestrating a public spectacle designed to destroy my professional reputation and paint me as an unstable threat. She was preparing to walk straight into the veterinary clinic, unaware that I was no longer the frightened girl she shoved onto the landing. The scent of clinical antiseptic and the frantic barking of boarded dogs greeted me on Monday morning. The veterinary hospital downtown served as my sanctuary. Inside those cinder block walls, I was not a grieving daughter or a financial hostage. I was a professional. I spent the first 3 hours of my shift drawing blood, prepping surgical trays, and focusing entirely on the animals. It was a practiced survival mechanism. If my hands were busy wrapping a sterile bandage, my brain could not obsess over the zero balance in my frozen checking account. The heavy glass door at the front of the lobby chimed shortly before noon. The waiting room was packed with anxious pet owners. I stood behind the reception desk updating a digital chart when the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I looked up. Nadine stood in the entryway. She wore a tailored wool coat, her hair impeccably styled, but her face was a masterpiece of manufactured distress. Her makeup was artfully smudged beneath her eyes. Her hands trembled as she clutched a leather handbag to her chest. She did not march up to the counter. She collapsed her against a waiting room chair, letting out a fractured, theatrical sob that drew the attention of every single person in the lobby. "Oh God, please help me!" Nadine cried out, her voice cracking with perfect precision. "My daughter, she is sick. She is so terribly sick." The performance was staggering. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me. In the span of 5 seconds, she transformed herself into a desperate, heartbroken caregiver, painting me as a fugitive fleeing a necessary psychiatric intervention. The clients sitting on the vinyl benches stared at me with sudden apprehension. I felt my heart thunder against my ribs. The instinct to hide the old conditioned response, to shrink away from her wrath, flared in my chest. But then I remembered Hector, sitting at his Formica table, mapping out her desperation on a yellow legal pad. She was not powerful today. She was panicking. My clinic manager, a stern woman named Zara, stepped out of her office at the sound of the commotion. Nadine saw the authority figure appear and instantly escalated her performance. She stumbled forward, pretending to be overwhelmed by dizzying grief. As she lurched toward the reception desk, she threw her weight intentionally sideways. Her shoulders slammed into a towering promotional display of premium prescription diet bags. The cardboard shelving buckled. Dozens of heavy foil sacks crashed to the linoleum floor, bursting open and sending a tidal wave of expensive kibble skittering across the lobby. Dogs barked frantically. Owners pulled back their leashes. The sheer destruction turned me from a valued employee into an immediate professional liability. Sarah stared at the disastrous mess, her jaw tight, evaluating the scene, while every eye in the room tracked the spilling dog food. A shadow slipped behind the reception counter. Britt had entered the clinic right behind her mother. My stepsister always operated as the flanker, utilizing the mean girl tactics she perfected in high school well into her late 20s. Before I could step around the desk to address Sarah, Britt grabbed my elbow. Her acrylic nails dug sharply into my forearm. She pulled me backward down the narrow, dimly lit hallway leading toward the radiology suite. The chaos in the lobby muffled our footsteps. Britt pushed me against the cool cinderblock wall, dropping the concerned sibling act entirely. Her face twisted into a venomous sneer. She smelled of stale espresso and expensive floral perfume. "You are going to fix this right now," Britt hissed, crowding my personal space to make me feel small. "You are going to sign that quitclaim deed by tomorrow morning." I kept my spine pressed straight against the wall. I did not break eye contact. I asked her what she planned to do if I refused to hand over my father's farmland. Britt smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of her lips. She reached into her designer pocket and pulled out her smartphone, tapping the screen once. She held it up. The image displayed was a heavily manipulated photograph pieced together to look incredibly compromising, framing me in a scenario that would ruin my standing in the local agricultural community and guarantee my termination from the clinic. "If you do not sign the deed," Britt whispered, "this goes to your boss. Then it goes to every farmer in Polk County. You will be a laughingstock. You will never work in this town again. We will burn your reputation to the ground." The threat hung in the narrow hallway. 2 days ago, that extortion would have paralyzed me. I would have crumbled, terrified of the public humiliation. But Hector had spent the entire weekend teaching me how to recognize weakness disguising itself as strength. If they actually held the high ground, they would not need fake photographs. I took a slow, steady breath. I slid my right hand into the deep pocket of my scrub top. My thumb brushed the edge of my smartphone. Without looking down, I found the side button. I double-clicked it, activating the voice memo shortcut I had configured that morning. A tiny haptic vibration pulsed against my thigh. The recording was live. I needed her to speak. I needed her to brag. I let my shoulders slump forward, mimicking defeat. I looked at the floor, forcing my voice to tremble just enough to sell the illusion of surrender. "I do not understand why you are doing this," I said, keeping my tone hushed. "You and your mother already control the liquid trust. You have all the money my father left behind. Why do you need the physical deed to the dirt so badly? Why is the land so important if you already won?" Britt rolled her eyes, scoffing at my apparent stupidity. The victory was too tempting for her ego to ignore. She could not resist the urge to gloat over a defeated opponent. "Because the trust money is a fraction of the pie, you idiot!" Britt snapped, her voice crisp and clear in the quiet hallway. "And the trust amendment giving Mom full control is a fake. Mom traced Ruben's signature the night his heart gave out. If we do not get the actual land deeds signed over to us legally, we have nothing to sell to the developers. We need your signature to legitimize the whole estate." The confession hit the microphone in my pocket with flawless clarity. She had just admitted to a felony forgery, unprompted, motivated entirely by her own arrogance. I waited 2 full seconds to ensure the audio captured the silence following her statement. Then I stopped slouching. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back. The faux trembling vanished. I looked Britt directly in the eyes, watching the smug satisfaction on her face slowly curdle into confusion as my demeanor shifted. "I am not signing anything," I stated calmly. "And you are going to clean up the dog food before you leave." I stepped around her, ignoring her sputtered, indignant gasp, and walked back into the main lobby. Nadine was still sobbing near the chairs, waiting for me to emerge. In tears, instead, I walked to the supply closet, retrieved a heavy push broom and held it out toward her. I turned to my clinic manager and explained, in a clear, professional voice, that these women were unauthorized trespassers, attempting a civil shakedown, and that I would be happy to contact the police to have them removed from the premises. Nadine stopped crying instantly. The mention of law enforcement broke her theatrical trance. Knowing her jewelry theft lie had failed the day before, she could not risk a real police interrogation. She grabbed her handbag, snatched the broom out of my hand, threw it onto the floor, and stormed out the glass door. Britt trailed right behind her, casting one final furious glare in my direction. That evening, back at the farmhouse, the smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. I sat at the formica table and placed my phone between Hector and me. I pressed play. Britt's arrogant, venomous voice filled the room, clearly admitting that Nadine forged my father's signature on the trust documents. I smiled, feeling a surge of adrenaline. I looked at my grandfather, expecting him to declare victory. I thought the war was over. I thought we had the silver bullet to end their reign. Hector listened to the playback twice. He reached out and tapped the screen, pausing the audio. He did not smile. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes calculating the next dozen moves on a chessboard I could barely see. "It is a good start, Gracie," he murmured, leaning back in his wooden chair. "But this recording is just a tool. A defense attorney can argue context, claim coercion, or tie it up in privacy statutes for months. You cannot tear down a brick house with a single screwdriver." He pointed at the dark window, gesturing toward the unseen city miles away. "She failed to break you at work today," Hector continued. "She knows intimidation is no longer effective, which means she is going to stop threatening your job and start attacking your sanity. We need the whole machine to crush her, and she is about to hand us the blueprints." He was right again. Realizing that bullying had lost its power, Nadine decided to change the battlefield entirely. She moved away from public ambushes and turned toward a much darker, far more clinical weapon. She decided to manipulate the medical system, pivoting her focus to the one person I had trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities. My grief counselor was about to receive a very disturbing phone call. Wednesday morning brought a fresh layer of frost to the Iowa plains, coating the bare oak trees in a brittle sheet of ice. I sat at the Formica table in Hector's kitchen, watching the winter sun struggle to break through the gray clouds. My day off from the veterinary clinic was supposed to bring a brief reprieve from the escalating tension. Instead, the quiet farmhouse became the stage for Nadine's most calculated strike yet. My smartphone vibrated against the wooden tabletop. The caller identification displayed the name of Dr. Mitchell Cole. He was a licensed clinical social worker with a private practice in West Des Moines. For 3 long years following my father's sudden heart attack, Dr. Cole's office had been my sole sanctuary. It was the only room where I allowed myself to drop the stoic facade. I had sat on his gray fabric sofa and wept over Ruben Perez navigating the overwhelming waves of a daughter's profound loss. I slid my finger across the glass screen and answered the call, expecting a routine scheduling update. The voice on the other end was not warm. It was tight, clinical, and stripped of all familiar empathy. Dr. Cole did not ask how my week was going. He asked a series of highly specific, rigid questions. He asked if I was currently in a safe environment. He asked if I had experienced any recent urges to harm myself or others. He asked if I had unmonitored access to firearms or prescription medications. A cold spike of dread drove itself into my stomach. These were not conversational inquiries. They constituted a standardized psychological triage protocol. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table. My voice shook as I asked him what was happening. Dr. Cole hesitated, his professional boundaries warring with 3 years of therapeutic rapport. He explained that his office had received a highly alarming digital package from my stepmother shortly after dawn. Nadine had not simply called him with empty complaints. She had curated an extensive, deeply invasive PDF dossier. The document contained pages of text messages I had allegedly sent to her over the past 48 hours. The betrayal began to crystallize in my mind. I demanded to know what the messages said. Dr. Cole read a few lines aloud, his tone grave. The texts read, "I cannot endure this pain anymore. I want everything to stop. I feel like burning this entire house to the ground just to feel warm." The words hit me like physical blows. I recognized them immediately. I had written those exact sentences, but I did not write them yesterday. I wrote them 36 months ago, during the agonizing, sleep-deprived month right after we buried my father. I was 21 years old, drowning in shock, sending unfiltered expressions of raw anguish to the woman I mistakenly thought was sharing my grief. Nadine had kept them. She had stored my most vulnerable moments in a digital vault for 3 years, waiting for the precise hour they could serve her agenda. She had cropped out the timestamps, isolated the darkest sentiments, and presented them to a licensed professional as a real-time mental health crisis. Dr. Cole explained that Nadine framed the texts as recent escalating threats directly linked to my sudden departure from the family home. She even included a twisted summary of the incident at the veterinary clinic. She claimed my departure from the lobby was a manic, destructive episode, resulting in hundreds of dollars in property damage. She told Dr. Cole she was terrified for my safety. She formally requested that he initiate a mandatory psychiatric hold, citing her deep maternal concern for my well-being. Nadine was constructing a certified clinical narrative. She wanted an official medical record stating I suffered from severe suicidal ideation and dangerous instability. My chest tightened, until drawing breath felt like pulling air through a crushed straw. The familiar, suffocating weight of my childhood trauma pressed down on my lungs. Nadine always possessed a terrifying talent for altering reality. She always knew how to position herself as the calm, long-suffering caretaker while painting everyone around her as irrational. Now she was weaponizing the one safe space I had left. I tried to explain the deception to Dr. Cole. I told him about the missing timestamps, the altered context, the extortion over the farm. But as the words tumbled out of my mouth in a rushed, frantic stream, I realized how I sounded. I sounded paranoid. I sounded exactly like the unstable, defensive girl Nadine described in her fraudulent dossier. Who would a judge believe? A weeping, well-dressed widow armed with printed text messages expressing self-harm? Or an exhausted veterinary technician hiding out on a rural farm claiming a grand conspiracy? Dr. Cole informed me that as a mandated reporter, he was legally obligated to document the exchange and monitor the situation closely. He urged me to come into the office for an emergency evaluation. I thanked him quietly, my voice hollow, and ended the call. I dropped the phone onto the tabletop. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to stem the tide of rising panic. The walls of the kitchen felt like they were shrinking inward. Nadine was using HIPAA and duty to warn laws as a vice. She was methodically stripping away my autonomy, building a cage out of my own stolen grief. Hector walked into the kitchen from the back mudroom. He wiped his heavy work boots on the mat, his sharp eyes instantly locking onto my pale, tear-streaked face. He did not rush over to coddle me. He did not offer hollow, sweeping reassurances. He walked straight to the counter, pulled a fresh paper filter from the cabinet, and began measuring dark roast coffee grounds into the machine. The rhythmic scoop and tap of the metal spoon grounded the room. The scent of bitter coffee began to fill the air, cutting through the sterile panic clawing at my throat. I looked at his broad back and explained the phone call. I detailed the curated text messages, the missing timestamps, and the formal request for a psychiatric hold. I told him that Nadine was burying me under a mountain of medical bureaucracy. Hector flipped the switch on the coffee maker. The machine hissed and sputtered, sending dark liquid streaming into the glass carafe. He turned around, leaning his hips against the granite counter. He pushed his wire-rimmed reading glasses up the bridge of his nose and studied me for a long moment. "She is fighting a ghost, Gracie," he said, his tone steady, carrying the quiet authority of a man who spent his life analyzing disaster claims. "She is operating on the assumption that you will panic, run into that therapist office, and scream about how unfair this is. She wants you to act erratic so she can validate her lies." He walked over to the table, carrying his steaming mug. He sat down opposite me, placing his large, calloused hands flat on the yellow formica. "Let her build her paper walls," he murmured, taking a slow sip of the dark roast. "Paper is flammable." I stared at him, the tremor in my hands slowly subsiding under his unshakable calm. I asked him how we could possibly fight a licensed medical record built on my own twisted words. "By understanding that liars always overplay their hand," Hector replied. "Nadine thinks bringing a doctor into this makes her story bulletproof. But medical professionals require verifications. They require raw metadata, phone company records, and sworn timelines. She is stacking dry kindling around herself, convinced she is building a fortress. When a judge asks for the original digital files to verify the timestamps, her entire narrative will turn to ash." He took another sip of coffee, his dark eyes narrowing with renewed focus. He stood up from the table and walked down the hallway to his home office. I heard the heavy sliding of a metal filing cabinet drawer. Hector returned carrying a thick stack of manila folders, entirely distinct from his vintage insurance ledger. He dropped them onto the table with a heavy thud. The folders smelled like dust and old parchment. He shifted the conversation away from my mental state, pivoting toward a much more dangerous horizon. "You need to ask yourself why she is risking this much exposure," Hector stated, tapping the top folder with his index finger. "Faking a domestic dispute with the police is one thing. Manipulating a licensed therapist into ordering a psychiatric hold is a severe legal gamble. Why is she risking a fraud charge just to label you unstable?" He opened the top folder, spreading out a series of large printed satellite maps and dense county tax assessments. They were detailed topographical layouts of Ruben Perez's 500 acres. "The answer is not in your medical file," Hector continued, his voice dropping an octave. "The answer is in the dirt." He pointed to a specific parcel of land, highlighted in yellow marker on the satellite map. It was a low-lying section of acreage situated near the southern river basin. It was the exact tract of soil my father had spent countless afternoons walking with me, teaching me the intricate science of crop rotation and moisture retention. Hector tapped the highlighted zone. He looked at me, the corners of his mouth turning down in a grim line. He asked me to recall the exact conditions of that specific river basin 2 years ago, right around the time Nadine took over the operational ledgers. I stared at the map. The lines denoting elevation and soil type blurred for a moment before snapping into sharp clarity. A new, chilling realization began to take root in my mind. The battleground was shifting away from the trauma of my childhood bedroom. It was moving outward toward the vast rolling fields of Iowa and straight into a multi-thousand-dollar federal cover-up that Nadine had desperately tried to bury. I stared at the yellow highlighted section on the topographical map spread across the Formica table. Hector tapped his thick index finger against the southern river basin. The memory hit me with the distinct metallic smell of impending rain and crushed dry leaves. I was 10 years old again, wearing mud-caked boots, struggling to keep pace with my father. Ruben Perez knelt in the dark Iowa dirt, digging his calloused, weather-beaten fingers into the soil to uproot a wilting soybean plant. He pointed to the dark, mushy roots hanging limply from the stem. He rubbed the diseased plant tissue between his thumb and forefinger, showing me the slick, decayed texture. He told me the condition was root rot. He explained how the southern river basin held too much standing water after a heavy spring snowmelt, turning the rich soil into a suffocating trap for the young seeds. "You cannot trick the earth, Gracie," he said, his deep voice carrying over the quiet field. "And you cannot trick the federal inspectors. My father taught me that day how the government issued crop subsidies and insurance payouts based on strict, verified yield reports. If the dirt was sick, a farmer had to report the loss honestly. You could never claim a harvest of healthy soybeans on a flooded tract of land. The Federal Agricultural Department audited those claims with ruthless precision, and Ruben Perez valued his integrity far more than a government check." The memory faded, leaving me staring at the glossy paper under the harsh kitchen lights. My grandfather slid a fresh stack of documents toward me. These were not satellite images. They were certified copies of county property tax records and preliminary commercial real estate filings. Hector had spent the morning accessing the public database, searching for any unauthorized encumbrances on my inheritance. He possessed the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a man who spent his entire career hunting for discrepancies in paperwork. Hector pointed a wooden pencil at a draft contract buried in the stack. It was a preliminary sales agreement offering to transfer a large portion of the Perez farm to a commercial paving and development firm called Apex Holdings. I read the signature line. Nadine had signed as the executor of the trust, legally promising to secure my signature on a quitclaim deed to finalize the sale. But Hector did not stop there. He pulled the state business registry for the shell company. He traced the registered agent, following the paper trail through 2 different proxy. But Hector did not stop there. He pulled the state business registry for the shell company. He traced the registered agent, following the paper trail through 2 different proxy addresses, until he hit the core ownership. The managing director of Apex Holdings was David Reed. David was Nadine's younger brother. My stepmother was orchestrating a quiet, illegal sale of my family legacy to her own sibling. She planned to strip the generational wealth out of the Perez name and wash it through a commercial development firm, keeping the profits entirely within her own bloodline. The illegal land sale was a staggering betrayal. But it was only half the picture. The real secret lived in the agricultural filings. Hector opened a heavy manila folder labeled United States Department of Agriculture. Inside sat the annual federal crop subsidy applications Nadine had submitted over the past 2 seasons. As the executor managing the operational trust, she held the legal authority to file the farm yield reports. I scanned the typed columns, my eyes darting to the specific acreage coordinates listed on the government forms. Nadine claimed a flawless, high-yield harvest of premium soybeans on the exact coordinates of the Southern River Basin. She filed requests for maximum federal green energy farming grants, certifying under penalty of perjury that the soil was producing top-tier crops. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, settling deep into my bones. I looked at Hector, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "The Southern Basin flooded 3 springs ago," I whispered, remembering the stagnant water that ruined the planting season right before my father died. "The topsoil washed out. Nothing but weeds and rot could grow down there for at least 5 years." Hector nodded slowly. He knew it. I knew it. Any farmer in Polk County knew it. But Nadine was a city woman who treated the farm like a personal checking account. She did not know the science of the soil. She saw empty acreage and fabricated a phantom harvest to extract federal grant money, routing the government checks directly into the liquid trust she controlled. She was committing systematic, documented wire fraud against the United States government. The scattered puzzle pieces of the last 3 years snapped together, forming a terrifying picture of calculated abuse. The daily intimidation, the psychological warfare, the heavy bruises I hid under oversized sweaters. It was never just about simple cruelty or a narcissistic power trip. It was a rigorous, strategic containment protocol. Nadine needed me broken, terrified, and compliant. If I had felt safe enough to walk the property, or confident enough to ask for the operational ledgers, I would have instantly realized the fields were barren while the books claimed a bumper crop. She kept me locked in a state of constant fear, so I would never look at the dirt. My pain was nothing more than an audit defense strategy. She used physical violence to protect a federal fraud scheme. The silence in the farmhouse shattered with the sudden crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. We both looked out the kitchen window. The setting sun cast long, dark shadows across the snow. A plain silver sedan parked near the porch. A man in a beige windbreaker stepped out carrying a thick manila envelope. He walked up the wooden steps and knocked firmly on the front door. Hector stood up, his jaw set in a tight, unyielding line. He walked to the entryway and opened the door. The man asked for Esther Perez. Before my grandfather could intervene, I stepped out from the kitchen and stood in the doorway. The man handed me the heavy envelope, stated that I had been served, and walked back to his running car without another word. I tore open the flap, pulling out a dense stack of legal filings. The bold header on the first page made the breath catch in my throat. It was an emergency petition for adult conservatorship. Nadine had taken the fabricated medical narrative from my grief counselor and escalated it to the highest local authority. She attached the manipulated text messages and the false report from the veterinary clinic as sworn exhibits. She was asking a county judge to strip away my basic human rights, claiming I was a severe danger to myself and incapable of managing my own affairs. If she won this petition, she would gain total, permanent legal control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my farmland. She would never need my signature on the quitclaim deed because she would legally become my guardian. The battle had officially moved from the shadows into the courtroom, and the stakes had just become my freedom. I stood in the entryway, holding the thick stack of legal filings. The heavy parchment felt like a lead weight dragging my arms toward the floor. The bold black ink at the top of the page glared back at me. Emergency petition for adult conservatorship. My eyes darted across the dense legal jargon, struggling to absorb the devastating reality of the words printed there. Nadine was not just trying to steal my father's land anymore. She was petitioning a Polk County judge to erase my legal existence. She wanted the state of Iowa to declare me incompetent. If she won, I would lose the right to sign a contract, the right to access my own medical records, and the ability to dictate where I lived. The physical abuse I endured upstairs in my childhood home would become a permanent court-sanctioned reality. My breathing turned shallow and rapid. I flipped to the attached exhibits. Nadine had constructed a masterpiece of fiction, using my stolen grief as the foundation. The first exhibit was the manipulated affidavit from Dr. Mitchell Cole. The document took my vulnerable, out-of-context text messages from 3 years ago and presented them as a current, desperate cry for psychiatric intervention. Next to the therapist report sat a sworn statement drafted by Nadine herself, detailing the incident at the veterinary clinic. She described me as erratic, violent, and causing massive property damage. She painted a picture of a grieving daughter who had finally snapped under the pressure of maintaining the family estate, arguing that immediate intervention was required to prevent me from harming myself or squandering Ruben Perez's legacy. The sheer audacity of the lies made the room spin. I dropped the papers onto the yellow formica table and backed away, my chest heaving. The phantom pain in my bruised shoulder flared to life. The walls of the farmhouse seemed to close in around me, replicating the suffocating terror of the dark hallway where Nadine used to push me around. I felt like the frightened 21-year-old girl again, entirely isolated, drowning in the shadow of a woman who knew exactly how to manipulate the outside world. I looked at Hector. I expected him to share my horror. I expected him to pace the floor, to yell about the injustice, to scramble for his phone to hire a defense attorney. Instead, my grandfather walked over to the coffee pot, poured a fresh cup of dark roast, and actually smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, predatory grin of a seasoned auditor discovering a fatal flaw in a fraudulent ledger. He picked up the heavy petition, thumbing through the pages with casual indifference. He did not see a threat. He saw a massive, catastrophic tactical error. I asked him how he could possibly smile while my freedom was actively being threatened. I told him Nadine had trapped us. With a medical professional expressing concern and a public disturbance on the record, a judge would rubber stamp the conservatorship and hand her the keys to my life. I was terrified that no one in a courtroom would believe the quiet veterinary technician over the weeping, impeccably dressed widow. Hector shook his head slowly, setting his mug down next to the terrifying legal documents. "You are looking at the trap from the inside, Gracie," he said, his voice calm and anchored. "Step outside and look at the mechanism. By filing this petition, Nadine has crossed a very specific line. She thinks the courtroom is a weapon she can wield against you. She forgot that the courtroom swings both ways." He tapped his thick index finger against the signature line on the petition. "In civil litigation, initiating a lawsuit opens the doors of legal discovery. To prove she is the rightful and responsible candidate to manage your affairs, Nadine must submit her own financial records to the court under the penalty of perjury. She has to prove she is financially sound, ethically above reproach, and acting entirely in your best interest. She believes her lies will hold up under oath because nobody has ever challenged her before. She thinks she can waltz into a hearing, shed a few tears, and walk out with the deed to your dirt." The brilliance of his strategy washed over me, cutting through the panic like a blade. By bringing her fabricated claims into a formal legal proceeding, Nadine had unknowingly volunteered to put her entire life under a judicial microscope. She had brought her offshore shell companies, her forged quitclaim deeds, and her federal crop subsidy fraud straight into the one arena where lying carries a mandatory prison sentence. She wanted a judge, Hector murmured, his dark eyes locked onto mine with fierce intensity. We are going to give her a judge, but we are not going to fight her on the conservatorship right now. If we hire a lawyer today and scream about the fraud, she might realize her mistake, withdraw the petition, and run. We need her locked into this legal process. We need her to swear on the record that her finances are pristine. To ensure her destruction, we had to make Nadine feel invincible. We had to feed her towering ego. Hector walked over to his home office and returned with a fresh legal pad. He sat down at the table and began drafting an email to Nadine's high-priced Cedar Rapids attorney. He explained that we were going to offer a complete, unconditional surrender. We would tell her that the stress of the legal battle was too much for my fragile mental state. We would offer to sign the quitclaim deed, handing over the 500 acres of prime Iowa farmland in exchange for her dropping the conservatorship petition. It was a massive gamble. We were dangling my inheritance as bait to lure a predator into a steel trap. As Hector began writing the surrender email, he intentionally misspelled my father's middle name in the opening paragraph. It was a subtle, brilliant psychological trick designed to make Nadine believe we were careless, panicked, and entirely broken. We needed her to arrive at the settlement table completely blind to the guillotine hanging over her head. The physical bruises on my shoulder were fading, but the real retaliation was just beginning to take shape. The yellow glow of the kitchen pendant light illuminated the screen of my grandfather's heavy laptop. We sat side by side at the Formica table, constructing a masterpiece of fabricated defeat. Hector typed with the slow, deliberate keystrokes of a man who measured every single word for its structural integrity. We were drafting a formal message to Nadine's high-priced legal counsel in Cedar Rapids. The goal was to construct an illusion of total surrender, convincing my stepmother that her aggressive conservatorship filing had successfully broken my spirit. I watched the sentences appear on the bright screen. The email stated that I was emotionally exhausted, physically drained, and entirely incapable of enduring a protracted battle in a Polk County courtroom. We offered a clean, immediate capitulation. I would sign the quitclaim deed transferring the 500 acres of prime Iowa farmland directly into Nadine's control. In exchange, she would withdraw the emergency psychiatric petition and unfreeze my personal bank accounts. It was everything she had demanded since the night I packed my duffel bag. To guarantee she swallowed the bait, Hector deployed a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation. He intentionally introduced a glaring typographical error into the most sensitive part of the message. My father was born Ruben Mateo Perez. Hector carefully typed Ruben Mateo Perez, adding an extra letter to his middle name. He leaned back, satisfied with the deliberate mistake. Nadine is a narcissist, Gracie, he explained, his voice low and steady. Narcissists do not just want to win, they want to feel superior. When she reads this email, she will not focus on the legal parameters, she will focus on the typo. She will view it as undeniable proof that you are frantic, careless, and completely unraveling under her pressure. She will be too busy mocking your mistakes to notice she is stepping into a snare. I reached across the keyboard and pressed the send button. A heavy silence settled over the kitchen as the digital message vanished into the ether. Surrendering my father's legacy, even on a fraudulent premise, felt like swallowing broken glass. But I trusted the man sitting next to me more than I trusted my own fears. We did not have to wait long. Less than 2 hours later, a response arrived in the inbox. Nadine did not just accept the terms, she leaped at them with a ravenous, undeniable greed. Her lawyer sent a brisk, authoritative reply dictating the parameters of our surrender. Nadine demanded that the mediation and document signing take place the following morning at her attorney's executive office building in Cedar Rapids. She wanted to force us to drive 2 hours out of our way, pulling us out of our local comfort zone and placing us squarely in her territory. She wanted to showcase her absolute power in a room filled with polished mahogany and expensive suits. At the bottom of the email, her lawyer included a deeply passive-aggressive postscript. He formally requested that I bring a valid state identification card to ensure the final quitclaim deed properly reflected my father's correct legal name, noting that my initial correspondence contained a rather embarrassing spelling error. Hector read the postscript and let out a dry, rasping chuckle. "She took the bait," he murmured, closing the laptop screen. "She is so blinded by her own arrogance that she cannot see the ground shifting beneath her feet." Now we build the guillotine. For the next 48 hours, my grandfather transformed his quiet, rural kitchen into a meticulous forensic war room. He did not sleep. He ran purely on black coffee and a righteous, cold anger. Hector had spent 30 years working as a senior crop insurance adjuster for the largest agricultural firms in the Midwest. His entire professional life was dedicated to untangling complex financial lies, tracking phantom yields, and proving when a farmer was attempting to defraud the system. He took that lifetime of specialized investigative skill and aimed it directly at my stepmother. The old inkjet printer in the corner of the room, Word continuously spitting out page after page of certified public records. Hector cross-referenced the property tax maps with the state business registry. He pulled the official incorporation documents for Apex Holdings, the commercial shell company Nadine intended to sell my land to. The documents clearly listed her younger brother, David Reed, as the primary registered agent. But the real, fatal blow required federal documentation. Hector accessed the United States Department of Agriculture database utilizing his old professional credentials to request certified copies of the specific crop subsidy forms Nadine had filed over the past 24 months. The paperwork arrived via a secure digital portal. Hector printed every single page. He laid the federal subsidy claims side by side with the preliminary commercial paving contracts Nadine had drafted with Apex Holdings. The contradiction was massive, undeniable, and highly illegal. On the federal forms, Nadine certified, under penalty of perjury, that the Southern River Basin was an active, healthy soybean field requiring maximum green energy agricultural grants. On the commercial contracts signed during that exact same week, she certified that the identical acreage was barren, uncultivated, and perfectly suited for a heavy concrete foundation. "You cannot grow federal soybeans under a commercial parking lot," Hector stated, circling the conflicting dates with a red pen. She has been collecting government disaster relief and green energy funds on dead soil, and she has been routing that federal money straight into the offshore accounts managed by her brother. This is not just a family dispute anymore, Gracie. This is documented wire fraud against the federal government. He gathered the stack of agricultural forms, the business registry printouts, the bank routing numbers, and the forged trust amendments. He tapped the thick pile of paper against the Formica table, aligning the edges into a perfectly neat, lethal weapon. He slid the entire stack into a heavy brown manila envelope and sealed the metal clasp. The next morning, the drive to Cedar Rapids was quiet and tense. The Iowa landscape rushed past the truck windows, a blur of snow-covered fields and gray winter skies. I stared at the sealed manila envelope resting on the dashboard. My stomach churned with a mixture of terror and anticipation. I was about to walk into a room specifically designed to intimidate me, facing a woman who had spent 3 years ensuring I felt small, powerless, and afraid. Hector kept his eyes focused on the highway. He did not offer empty motivational speeches. He gave me precise, tactical instructions. "When we walk into that conference room, Nadine is going to try to provoke you," Hector said, his voice cutting through the hum of the truck engine. "She is going to use every psychological trigger she installed in your brain. She will mock you, She will demand apologies. She will act like a queen receiving a peasant. He reached over and tapped the thick envelope resting on the dashboard. "You are going to let her talk," he instructed. "You are not going to defend yourself. You are not going to raise your voice. You will maintain absolute silence. Let her bloat the room with her own arrogance. Let her sign the final financial affidavits swearing her estate management has been perfect. And when her lawyer asks for your signature on the quitclaim deed to surrender your land, you do not speak. You just look her dead in the eye and you slide this envelope across the mahogany table." We pulled into the parking lot of the towering glass office building in downtown Cedar Rapids. I picked up the heavy envelope, feeling the weight of the certified truth in my hands. The days of hiding my bruises under oversized sweatshirts were over. We were stepping into Nadine's arena, but she was entirely unaware that we had brought a nuclear weapon to a knife fight. The morning of the scheduled mediation arrived with a biting, bitter cold that rattled the old window panes of the farmhouse. I stood by the kitchen sink, watching the sky turn a pale, bruised gray. The weather forecast predicted an early, vicious ice storm, the kind of severe Midwestern weather event that snaps power lines and brings entire counties to a grinding halt. I turned around to find Hector sitting at the Formica table. He was staring at the thick manila envelope containing the printed digital copies of Nadine's federal crop subsidy applications. He had not touched his coffee. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered beneath his weathered skin. He reached out and dragged a thick, calloused finger across the top page of the digital printout. "We have a massive problem, Gracie," he murmured, his voice rumbling with sudden urgency. My stomach dropped. I walked over and looked at the papers. They detailed the exact wire fraud scheme we uncovered the night before. I asked him what could possibly be wrong with the documents. They proved her guilt perfectly. Hector shook his head, pushing his wire-rimmed reading glasses up the bridge of his nose. "These are digital portal printouts," he explained, tapping the paper. "They are uncertified copies. If we walk into a high-priced legal mediation in Cedar Rapids and slide these across a mahogany table, Nadine's attorney will not even blink. He is a seasoned corporate litigator. He will instantly object to their admissibility. He will claim they are unverified, easily manipulated digital reproductions. He will dismiss them as hearsay, refuse to acknowledge the fraud, and terminate the meeting." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. If her lawyer rejected our evidence, the fake surrender we orchestrated would become a permanent reality. We would have no leverage to force her hand. Nadine would walk out of the room, march straight into the Polk County Courthouse on Tuesday morning, and successfully push the emergency conservatorship through before we could mount a proper defense. She would own my life. "We need the blue ink," Hector stated, standing up so abruptly his wooden chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. "We need the physical raised seal and the certified signature stamp from the regional agricultural clerk. We need the original authenticated files. A corporate lawyer can argue with a computer printout, but he cannot argue with a government seal." I glanced at the clock hanging above the stove. It was currently 8 in the morning. The regional United States Department of Agriculture office was located in a neighboring county, a solid 90-minute drive under normal conditions. But today was the Friday preceding a long federal holiday weekend. Government offices closed early on holiday Fridays. The clerk's desk would shut down exactly at noon, locking the vital records behind closed doors until the following Tuesday. By Tuesday, it would be entirely too late. "Grab your coat," Hector ordered, grabbing his keys from the counter. "We are racing the storm." We sprinted out the front door and climbed into his heavy-duty pickup truck. The engine roared to life, fighting against the freezing temperature. As we backed out of the gravel driveway, the first sharp pellets of freezing rain began to strike the windshield. The ice storm had arrived hours earlier than the meteorologist predicted. The drive across the rural Iowa highways transformed into a white-knuckle battle against nature. The asphalt quickly coated itself in a treacherous, shimmering layer of black ice. The wind howled across the flat, barren fields, whipping sleet violently against the metal side panels of the truck. Visibility plummeted. Other vehicles crept along the shoulder, their hazard lights blinking weakly in the gray gloom, defeated by the hazardous conditions. But Hector did not slow down. He gripped the leather steering wheel with absolute, unshakable confidence. My grandfather had spent over 30 years working as a senior crop insurance adjuster. His entire professional life was defined by navigating these exact, unforgiving rural roads during the most catastrophic weather events imaginable. He had driven through blizzards, floods, and tornadoes to verify destroyed harvests and support devastated farmers. He knew every blind curve, every county line shortcut, and every shifting nuance of an Iowa ice storm. He maneuvered the heavy truck with masterful precision, treating the treacherous elements not as a barrier, but as a familiar adversary. He maintained a steady, calculated speed, his eyes scanning the frozen horizon. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands gripping the safety handle, silently praying that his decades of experience would carry us through the tempest. The digital clock on the dashboard mocked our progress. 10:30. 11. 11:15. Every minute that slipped away tightened the invisible noose around my neck. If we failed to reach the regional office, Nadine would win. She would legally erase my autonomy. She would sell my father's farmland to her brother. She would continue living a life of luxury built on a foundation of my stolen inheritance and fabricated mental illness. The profound injustice of her impending victory fueled a quiet, burning determination inside my chest. I refused to let the weather defeat us when we were so close to the truth. We crossed the county line at 11:30. The regional agricultural building finally materialized through the curtain of freezing rain. It was a modest, brutalist brick structure, sitting at the edge of town surrounded by an icy, desolate parking lot. Hector threw the truck into park, killing the engine before the vehicle completely stopped moving. We threw open the heavy doors and bolted across the slick pavement, our boots struggling to find purchase on the solid sheet of ice. The freezing rain stung my cheeks like shattered glass, but I ignored the pain, focusing entirely on the glass entrance doors ahead. We burst into the government building, panting heavily, brushing melting sleet from our coats. The large digital clock on the lobby wall displayed 11:56. We had exactly 4 minutes before the office shut down for the long weekend. Hector marched straight to the records window. A tired-looking clerk was already pulling down the metal security grate, preparing to leave for the holiday. My grandfather did not raise his voice, nor did he display any frantic desperation. He simply placed his weathered hands on the counter, looked the clerk directly in the eye, and invoked his old, highly respected professional credentials. He spoke with the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who commanded respect through decades of honest labor. He requested the immediate certified authentication of the specific crop subsidy filings attached to the Perez estate. The clerk paused, recognizing Hector's name and former title. She sighed, pushed the metal grate back up, and walked toward the secure filing cabinets. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. I watched the second hand sweep across the large wall clock. 11:58. 11:59. The clerk returned to the counter, holding a thick stack of manila folders. She opened them, retrieved a heavy metal stamp, and pressed it firmly onto the bottom of each page. The crisp, audible thud of the stamp hitting the paper sounded like a gavel falling in a silent courtroom. She signed her name across the blue ink seal, officially certifying the documents as verified, unalterable federal records. She handed the files to my grandfather exactly as the clock struck noon. Hector thanked her graciously, his posture perfectly straight. We walked away from the counter and found a quiet wooden bench near the exit. My grandfather opened his coat and reached for a specific object he had brought from the farmhouse. It was a battered, heavily worn leather briefcase. The leather was scarred and faded, carrying the physical history of countless audits, investigations, and battles fought on behalf of honest people. He carefully slid the freshly stamped, undeniable proof of Nadine's federal wire fraud into the dark interior of the briefcase. He snapped the brass locks shut with a sharp, echoing click. The sound resonated in the empty lobby, signaling the end of our defensive retreat. The trap was now fully armed. We had secured the legal silver bullet required to bypass her high-priced corporate lawyer. We possessed the authenticated evidence needed to destroy her fabricated narrative and expose her criminal enterprise. We walked back out into the freezing storm, climbed into the icy truck cabin, and began the final leg of our journey toward Cedar Rapids. The frantic, desperate energy of the morning evaporated, replaced by a profound, chilling stillness. Neither of us turned on the radio. Neither of us spoke a single word. The silence inside the truck was not born of fear or hesitation. It was the heavy, focused quiet of two people marching toward an inevitable reckoning. As we approached the towering glass skyline of the city, my thoughts shifted to the mediation room waiting for us. I knew Nadine would be sitting in a plush leather chair, surrounded by polished mahogany, dripping in unearned arrogance. She believed she was about to accept the unconditional surrender of a broken, unstable girl. She believed her manipulation of my medical records and her forged land deeds had secured her ultimate victory. She had no idea that the battered leather briefcase resting on the floorboard of my grandfather's truck contained the exact instruments of her absolute ruin. We were walking into the belly of the beast, and she was entirely unprepared for the trap to snap shut. The elevator ride up to the 50th floor of the Montgomery and Pierce corporate law firm felt like ascending into a completely different atmosphere. Leaving the biting Iowa ice storm behind on the street level, we stepped into a sprawling reception area that smelled faintly of expensive espresso, lemon Polish, and genuine leather. The sheer opulence of the space was designed to be a psychological weapon. It was meant to intimidate anyone who walked through the heavy glass doors, reminding visitors that the attorneys inside dealt in power, wealth, and absolute control. I walked slightly behind my grandfather, my boots sinking into the plush carpet, focusing on the rhythm of my own breathing to keep the rising panic at bay. A receptionist with a perfectly neutral expression guided us down a long, quiet corridor lined with abstract art. She opened the door to the primary conference room. The space was exactly as Hector had predicted. It was a fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass and dark, imposing mahogany. Nadine sat at the head of the massive table. She wore a pristine cream-colored tailored blazer, looking entirely untouched by the freezing rain outside. Her hair was immaculately styled, her makeup flawless. Next to her sat her primary attorney, a man whose bespoke suit and perfectly knotted tie probably cost more than my first vehicle. Nadine held a heavy gold-plated fountain pen in her right hand. She tapped it rhythmically against the polished wood of the conference table. It was a deliberate, sharp sound meant to replicate a ticking clock. It served as an auditory tactic designed to trigger anxiety, silently reminding me that my time had run out, and she held all the leverage. She did not offer a greeting when we walked into the room. She looked at me with an expression of profound condescension, the specific kind of look a victorious sovereign gives a defeated rebel brought in for sentencing. She motioned toward the empty chairs opposite her, demanding that we sit down and finalize the transaction without any unnecessary delays. She placed the quitclaim deed in the exact center of the mahogany table, right under the warm glow of the overhead lighting. Her attorney folded his hands over a legal pad and began reciting the terms of our surrender with a bored, clinical detachment. He stated that upon my verified signature on the deed, the emergency conservatorship petition would be immediately withdrawn from the Polk County judicial docket. Furthermore, my personal bank accounts would be unfrozen by the end of the business day. In exchange for restoring my basic autonomy, all 500 acres of Ruben Perez's agricultural estate would transfer irrevocably into Nadine's sole control, granting her the unchecked authority to develop, sell, or subdivide the land as she saw fit. Nadine interrupted her lawyer to add her own personal requirement to the settlement. She leaned forward, the gold pen pausing its rhythmic tapping against the wood. She demanded a formal apology. She wanted me to look her in the eye, in front of the legal counsel and the certified notary public sitting quietly in the corner, and verbally apologize for forcing her to take such drastic protective measures. She claimed my erratic behavior was a massive embarrassment to the family name. She stated that my mental instability had caused her profound emotional distress, and she deserved to hear me admit that she was only trying to save me from my own destructive habits. I sat perfectly still. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the soft, durable fabric of my trousers. I did not break eye contact with her, but I also did not offer a single word of defense or retaliation. I let her bloat the room with her own toxic arrogance, adhering strictly to the strategy Hector had laid out during the drive. I remembered the heavy bruises fading on my shoulder. I remembered the terror of the public ambush at the veterinary clinic. But in that glass room, I felt a strange, powerful calm wash over me. I was completely unbothered by her insults because I knew her entire reality was about to shatter. Hector stepped into his role with the flawless skill of a seasoned stage actor. He allowed his broad, capable shoulders to slump forward, diminishing his physical presence. He lowered his gaze to the table, projecting the image of a tired, broken farmer who simply wanted to shield his vulnerable granddaughter from the horrors of a psychiatric courtroom battle. He let out a long, ragged sigh, reaching into his heavy winter coat pocket to retrieve his wire-rimmed reading glasses. My grandfather addressed Nadine's corporate lawyer with a tone of quiet resignation. He stated that we were fully prepared to sign the quitclaim deed and walk away from the property forever. However, Hector noted that transferring a commercial agricultural estate in the state of Iowa required a specific administrative formality to ensure the county title company would process the transaction without placing a temporary hold on the transfer. Hector opened a plain manila folder he had carried under his arm and extracted a single sheet of paper. It was a standard state financial disclosure affidavit. He explained to the attorney that the local county clerk required the current, active executor of the trust to verify under oath that the property was free of hidden debts, unrecorded commercial encumbrances, or fraudulent financial activities before a quitclaim transfer could be legally authorized and finalized. The corporate lawyer briefly reviewed the header of the document. He nodded in agreement, turning to confirm to Nadine that it was indeed a standard, mandatory administrative requirement for rural land transfers in that specific jurisdiction. He slid the paper toward his client, advising her to sign it quickly so they could conclude the meeting and secure the highly valuable acreage. Nadine picked up the affidavit with a dismissive wave of her hand. She did not bother reading the fine print covering the bottom half of the page. She did not scan the specific clauses regarding federal crop subsidies, commercial development liens, or shell company transfers. Her eyes were locked entirely on the ultimate prize waiting at the center of the table. The 500 acres of prime, generational soil were merely inches away from her grasp, and she was desperate to close her fingers around the wealth they represented. But her narcissistic nature could not resist one final opportunity to assert her total dominance over us. She looked at the dense legal document, then looked up at Hector with a smirk so vicious and cold it made my stomach turn. She casually brought up the surrender email we had sent 2 days prior. She mocked the spelling error with malicious glee. She let out a sharp, brittle laugh that echoed harshly off the glass walls, stating that it was a profound shame Ruben Mateo Perez could not be sitting here today to see how carelessly and stupidly we handled his hard-earned legacy. She stressed the extra letter in the middle name, deliberately weaponizing my dead father's memory in an attempt to inflict maximum psychological pain before tossing me out into the cold. I felt a flash of pure, unadulterated heat rush through my veins. The urge to reach across the wide mahogany table and strike her across the face was nearly overwhelming. But I remained a statue. I breathed in deeply, letting the sterile, climate-controlled air fill my lungs. I knew a secret she did not. Her mockery was not a display of strength. It was the frantic, pathetic flailing of a predator stepping blindly into a lethal snare. Nadine uncapped her $500 fountain pen. She pressed the gold nib against the thick parchment of the state financial disclosure affidavit. The scratch of the metal tip against the paper sounded exceptionally loud in the quiet conference room. She signed her full legal name with a flourishing, dramatic, and highly practiced cursive script. She pushed the paper away from herself, sliding it toward the certified notary public sitting silently at the edge of the room. The notary carefully reviewed the signature, picked up his heavy embossing tool, applied the raised seal, and stamped the date in bright blue ink. The trap snapped shut with absolute devastating finality. By putting her signature on that notarized page, Nadine had just sworn under penalty of perjury that the Perez estate carried no conflicting commercial contracts and possessed no fraudulent federal filings. She had officially certified to officers of the court that her financial management of the trust was pristine and legally flawless. She had absolutely no idea that we had just spent the entire morning racing a catastrophic ice storm to secure the exact federal documents proving the complete opposite. Nadine slid the quitclaim deed toward me, tapping the empty signature line with a manicured fingernail. She leaned back in her expensive leather chair, crossing her arms over her chest, waiting for my final act of submission. She told me to sign the paper, leave the building, and get out of her sight forever. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly, violently altering the atmospheric pressure. Hector did not look tired anymore. His shoulders straightened, pulling his posture into a rigid, imposing wall of solid muscle and bone. He reached down to the floorboard and lifted the battered, heavily scarred leather briefcase we had carried out of the regional agricultural office. He placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany table, setting it right on top of the blank quitclaim deed. The dull brass locks clicked open with a sharp, heavy sound, mimicking the noise of a rifle action sliding into place. Nadine frowned deeply, her smug expression faltering for the very first time since she entered the clinic days ago. Her attorney sat forward, his professional detachment evaporating entirely as he registered the sudden, dangerous change in my grandfather's demeanor. I reached into the open briefcase, bypassing the quitclaim deed entirely, and pulled out the heavy, sealed federal envelope. The fake surrender was over. The real meeting was finally about to begin, and the high-priced lawyer sitting across from me was about to realize his client had just committed a massive felony right in front of his eyes. The mahogany table stretched between us like an active battlefield. Nadine tapped her gold fountain pen, waiting for my absolute surrender. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were perfectly steady. I unlocked the screen, opened the voice memos application, pressed play, and set the device flat on the polished wood. The digital audio filled the silent, glass-walled conference room. It was the recording from the parking lot confrontation outside the grocery store. Britt sounded exactly as she always did, shrill, entitled, and completely oblivious to consequence. Growing up, my stepsister never faced a single repercussion. If she wrecked a vehicle, Nadine bought her a newer model. If she failed a class, Nadine threatened the administration until the grade changed. That lifelong shield of immunity was evident in every syllable she spoke on the tape. Her recorded voice echoed off the expensive glass panels, clearly demanding that I sign over the agricultural land to fund her boutique lease. Then came the devastating admission. Britt openly bragged that Nadine had forged Ruben Perez's initials on the original trust amendment. She laughed on the recording, calling my father a gullible old fool and boasting that the paperwork was already processed. For a fraction of a second, the blood drained entirely from Nadine's face. Her immaculate complexion turned the color of old ash. She looked at her attorney, genuine panic flashing in her dark eyes. She thought she was caught. She thought the empire she built on my stolen inheritance was crumbling. But the high-priced corporate lawyer sitting beside her did not panic. He did not gasp. He simply let out a low, amused chuckle. He reached out with a manicured hand and casually turned my phone face down on the table, silencing the playback. He leaned back in his plush leather executive chair, steepling his fingers together. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound amusement. He launched into a smooth, practiced legal monologue that completely dismantled my supposed silver bullet. He cited strict state privacy statutes and complex jurisdictional precedents. He explained that although Iowa generally permitted certain recordings, the specific context of the confrontation created a reasonable expectation of privacy. He argued with blistering legal precision that capturing his client's daughter on tape without explicit two-party consent in that particular setting constituted a severe violation of local wiretapping technicalities. He declared the audio file fundamentally inadmissible. He stated that no civil court judge would ever allow that recording into evidence, and attempting to submit it would only expose me to a countersuit for illegal surveillance. He waved his hand dismissively, officially categorizing my greatest piece of leverage as absolute legal garbage. The tension in my chest tightened. The audience of attorneys and notaries in the room visibly relaxed, realizing the threat was neutralized. Nadine exhaled a long, shaky breath. The color flooded back into her cheeks. Her panic instantly morphed into a towering, vicious sense of victory. She threw her head back and laughed. It was a cruel, grating sound that scraped against my nerves. She leaned across the table, her eyes practically shining with malice. She called me pathetic. She mocked my attempt at playing a spy, stating that I was just as useless and incompetent as I had always been. She demanded that I stop wasting her expensive billable hours, pick up the pen, and sign the quitclaim deed before she lost her temper and had me removed by building security. It was the perfect red herring. We had intentionally played our weakest card first, allowing her legal counsel to expertly shoot it down. We gave them the opportunity to feel invincible. I looked to my left. Hector sat like a stone monument. He did not flinch when the lawyer dismantled the recording. He did not react to Nadine's mocking laughter. He simply reached down to the floorboard and hoisted the battered leather briefcase onto his lap. That briefcase was a silent witness to decades of agricultural investigations. It had survived floods, droughts, and countless confrontations with fraudulent insurance claimants. Hector unlatched the heavy brass locks. The sharp metallic click silenced Nadine's laughter instantly. "That is perfectly fine," Counselor Hector said, his voice as smooth and cold as a frozen river. "We do not need a parking lot recording to prove your client is a fraud. The audio was merely a distraction. We just needed her to sign that state affidavit." Hector reached into the dark interior of the briefcase. He pulled out the thick, brown federal envelope we had secured mere hours ago from the regional agricultural clerk. The heavy parchment was sealed with official government tape. He placed the envelope on the polished mahogany and slid it slowly across the wide table. The friction of the heavy paper sliding against the wood made a distinct whispering sound. It stopped exactly in front of the corporate lawyer. "I advise you to open that before your client says another word," Hector instructed, folding his calloused hands together. The attorney frowned, his smug demeanor cracking slightly. He picked up the brown envelope, broke the federal seal, and extracted the dense stack of United States Department of Agriculture crop subsidy applications. He flipped to the first page, his eyes scanning the official blue ink stamps and the raised certification seals that proved the documents were unalterable government records. I watched the lawyer's face closely. I watched the exact moment his elite corporate confidence shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He read the acreage coordinates listed on the federal subsidy forms. He saw that Nadine had certified under penalty of perjury that the Southern River Basin was producing a massive yield of premium soybeans, collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in green energy agricultural grants. Then the lawyer slowly turned his head and looked at the state financial disclosure affidavit sitting on the table. The exact document Nadine had signed less than 3 minutes ago. The document where she swore to officers of the court that the identical acreage was completely barren, unencumbered, and ready for commercial concrete development. The mathematical impossibility crashed down upon the attorney. You cannot grow federally subsidized crops underneath a commercial parking lot. The lawyer realized he was no longer managing a simple family estate dispute. He was sitting adjacent to a woman who had just committed documented federal wire fraud and blatant perjury in the direct presence of a certified notary public. The legal jeopardy was astronomical, and by facilitating the mediation, the lawyer's own professional license was now dangling over a blazing fire. The air inside the glass-walled conference room grew heavy thick with the undeniable reality of an impending legal disaster. I sat perfectly still, observing the catastrophic failure of Nadine's carefully constructed empire. For 3 agonizing years, she had relied on intimidation and emotional manipulation to control every aspect of my existence. She used my father's sudden death as an opportunity to isolate me, turning my grief into a weapon that kept me trapped inside my childhood home. She believed that power was absolute. She believed that because I was quiet, because I avoided confrontation, I was fundamentally weak. She failed to recognize that silence is often the loudest form of observation. While she spent her days curating a luxurious lifestyle funded by stolen agricultural wealth, I spent my days watching her. I cataloged every inconsistency, every lie, every time she changed her story to suit her financial needs. And when Hector arrived and pulled me from the wreckage, we combined my observations with his relentless, methodical expertise. We did not build a case based on emotion. We built a case based on undeniable, certified paper. Nadine's lawyer slowly removed his expensive eyeglasses. His hands were shaking a subtle tremor that betrayed the monumental panic rising inside his chest. He looked at Hector, recognizing the seasoned, ruthless efficiency of a man who spent a lifetime dismantling fraudulent claims. The corporate attorney realized he had been entirely outmaneuvered. He had been so focused on bullying a 24-year-old veterinary technician that he completely ignored the quiet, retired crop adjuster sitting at the table. My stepmother continued to demand answers, her voice escalating in volume. She slammed her open palm against the mahogany wood, shattering the professional decorum of the executive suite. She ordered her lawyer to explain what was contained within the brown envelope. She threatened to fire him, claiming she paid him exorbitant retainer fees to secure her property, not to sit in stunned silence while we played games. The attorney ignored her threats. He turned his attention back to the state financial disclosure affidavit. The ink from Nadine's fountain pen was barely dry. That signature represented a binding legal oath. By signing it while simultaneously running a shadow corporation funded by fake federal crop yields, she had activated a self-destruct sequence on her entire life. "You lied to me," the attorney whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound fear. "You sat in my office, you looked me in the eye, and you swore the estate was clean." Nadine scoffed, rolling her eyes in a theatrical display of annoyance. She waved her hand dismissively, telling him to stop being dramatic. She claimed whatever paperwork Hector produced was fabricated nonsense, exactly like the audio recording. She remained entirely blinded by her own narcissism, unable to fathom a reality where her actions carried severe consequences. She believed her wealth, her status, and her aggressive demeanor made her permanently untouchable. Hector leaned forward, resting his forearms on the edge of the table. He looked directly at the high-priced lawyer, ignoring my stepmother completely. Counselor Hector said, his tone carrying the gravity of a judge delivering a final verdict. My granddaughter and I are going to stand up and walk out of this room. We are leaving the quitclaim deed entirely blank. However, we are leaving you with copies of those certified federal records. I highly recommend you spend the next hour determining exactly how you intend to separate yourself from your client's massive federal wire fraud scheme before the United States Department of Agriculture sends federal agents to audit this firm. The lawyer swallowed hard, his throat moving nervously. He did not object. He did not attempt to stop us. He simply stared at the documents, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the criminal exposure sitting on his conference table. Nadine finally realized the severity of the situation. The mockery vanished from her face, replaced by a dark, volatile rage. The polished veneer of the grieving, concerned mother melted away entirely. Her features twisted into a mask of pure hatred. She realized that the legal maneuver she designed to trap me had instead become her own execution block. She had willingly walked into the snare, signed her name to the poison pill, and handed us the ultimate victory. The transition from smug victor to cornered animal happened in a fraction of a second, setting the stage for a violent, uncontrolled explosion that would forever alter the trajectory of our lives. The corporate attorney stood up. His leather chair rolled backward, bumping loudly against the thick glass wall of the conference room. He looked at the certified notary public, who was already packing up her brass embossing seal, clearly eager to escape the impending blast radius. The lawyer spoke with a rigid, formal cadence, officially declaring on the record that he was immediately withdrawing as legal counsel for Nadine Perez. He stated plainly that he could not ethically represent a client who had just utilized his firm and his presence to execute a blatantly perjured affidavit. He grabbed his briefcase from the floor and walked out of the executive suite without looking back, severing his professional ties to her rapidly sinking ship. Nadine sat entirely frozen. The absolute sudden abandonment by her legal shield short-circuited her carefully manicured composure. The realization that she was legally naked, facing federal prison time without high-priced protection, finally breached her towering narcissistic defenses. She slowly turned her gaze toward me. The polished mask of the sophisticated grieving widow evaporated completely, replaced by a feral, unhinged fury. I was no longer her obedient punching bag. I was the architect of her destruction, and she could not process the shift in power. She lunged. It was a vicious, uncoordinated scramble across the wide expanse of the mahogany table. She reached for my throat, her manicured fingers curled like predatory talons. As she propelled her body forward, her forearm clipped the heavy gold fountain pen she had just used to sign the fatal document. The expensive writing instrument spun off the polished wood and struck the floor. The ink cartridge ruptured upon impact. A thick puddle of dark black ink splattered directly across the toes of her pristine, cream-colored designer shoes, permanently staining her flawless facade. She never reached me. Before I could even flinch, Hector moved. His reaction time defied his advanced age, fueled by a lifetime of wrestling heavy farm equipment and wrangling massive livestock. He intercepted her attack flawlessly. His large, calloused hand clamped around Nadine's slender wrist mid-air, stopping her forward momentum with the immovable force of a solid concrete pillar. Nadine gasped, her dark eyes widening in genuine shock as her arm was suddenly immobilized. She tried to yank her hand away, but Hector's grip was absolute. He did not squeeze hard enough to break bone, but he held her tightly enough to convey total, terrifying dominance. "The days of you leaving marks on my family are over," Hector stated. His voice did not echo in the room. It was a low, dangerous rumble, a promise forged in heavy iron. He released her wrist with a deliberate, forceful shove, sending her stumbling backward. She collapsed into her plush leather chair, her chest heaving, staring blankly at the ruined, ink-stained leather of her expensive footwear. She looked small, chaotic, and entirely pathetic. We did not wait for her to recover her breath. Hector picked up his battered briefcase, placed a protective, warm hand on my back, and guided me out of the executive suite. We rode the elevator down to the street level in profound silence. As soon as we climbed into the warm cabin of his pickup truck, Hector did not drive toward the farmhouse. He drove straight to the local magistrate. Nadine had escalated the conflict from financial manipulation to attempted physical violence in front of sworn officers of the court. We were going to weaponize her catastrophic lack of control. Hector filed an emergency counter-motion that exact same afternoon. We submitted a formal request for a protective order based on the attempted assault in the mediation room, coupled with an immediate demand for a forensic audit of the Perez Operational Trust based on the authenticated agricultural fraud. By introducing the documented physical threat alongside the massive financial discrepancies, Hector effectively hijacked her original conservatorship petition. The presiding judge reviewed our emergency filings and immediately suspended Nadine's administrative powers pending a hearing. The court ordered all parties to appear for a comprehensive, expedited evidentiary review. We successfully forced the entire battle out of the private corporate shadows and into the stark, unforgiving light of a public courtroom. 48 hours later, the heavy wooden doors of the Polk County Municipal Courthouse swung open. The atmosphere inside the municipal building was entirely different from the luxurious Cedar Rapids law firm. The air smelled of old floor wax, damp wool coats, and institutional bleach. There were no abstract paintings or espresso machines here. It was a cold, clinical arena designed for dissecting the truth. I sat at the plaintiff table, resting my hands flat against the scratched wooden surface. I wore a simple navy blazer and slacks, projecting a calm, professional demeanor. I watched the gallery fill with strangers, clerks, and curious legal aides. Then Nadine walked through the swinging wooden gate. The transformation was incredibly jarring. She had entirely abandoned her wealthy, cosmopolitan aesthetic. She wore a dull, oversized gray cardigan and faded slacks, attempting to weaponize visual sympathy. She wanted the judge to see a tired, overwhelmed mother pushed to the brink by an unstable stepdaughter. Beside her sat a new attorney. He was not wearing a bespoke suit. He looked overworked, shuffling through a disorganized stack of papers, clearly hired at the absolute last minute because every reputable firm in the state would have run a conflict check and discovered her impending federal wire fraud indictment. The bailiff called the courtroom to order. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding financial elder abuse and estate fraud, took the bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and stared down at the sprawling mess of petitions, counter-motions, and protective orders cluttering her heavy oak desk. Nadine's discount lawyer stood up first. He attempted to execute the original game plan, portraying me as deeply troubled and legally incompetent. He referenced the manipulated text messages from my grief counselor, arguing that my wild accusations of fraud were simply the paranoid delusions of a grieving child refusing to accept reality. He urged the court to grant the conservatorship to his client immediately, claiming Nadine was the only person capable of saving the Perez farm from total ruin. The judge listened patiently, her expression completely unreadable. When the defense finished their opening remarks, she turned her attention to our table. She asked if we had any substantial evidence to refute the petitioner's claims regarding my mental fitness and the management of the estate. Hector stood up. He did not bring fiery rhetoric. He brought the paper guillotine. He carried a massive, meticulously indexed binder to the witness stand. He was sworn in, his right hand resting firmly on the Bible. When he sat down, he opened the binder and began systematically dismantling my stepmother's entire existence. He did not speak with malice. He spoke with the clinical, devastating precision of an auditor delivering a final damage report. He submitted the bank routing numbers tracing the exact path of the liquid trust funds into the shell company managed by David Reed. He provided the county property tax records highlighting the forged quitclaim agreement. Then he presented the fatal combination. He submitted the sworn state financial disclosure affidavit Nadine signed in Cedar Rapids, followed immediately by the blue ink stamped federal agricultural subsidy forms. The judge spent several long minutes reading the documents. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the heating ventilation system vibrating above us. The judge compared the acreage coordinates on the commercial paving contract to the coordinates on the federal soybean grants. The mathematical impossibility was verified by multiple government seals. Nadine's lies crumbled under the crushing weight of certified paper. Her new lawyer slowly closed his disorganized folder and sank lower into his chair, recognizing the unmistakable scent of a lost cause. He realized his client had lied to him, bringing a fraudulent case before a judge notorious for severely punishing perjury. The judge removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose with a weary sigh. She looked directly at Nadine, her voice dripping with intense judicial disdain. She stated that she had reviewed the financial exhibits, and the discrepancies were beyond alarming. The attempt to strip an heir of their bodily autonomy to cover up blatant embezzlement was one of the most egregious abuses of the legal system she had encountered during her tenure on the bench. However, the judge noted there was one remaining element to address before rendering a final ruling. She pointed to the emergency protective order we filed following the mediation room incident. She asked Hector to provide the specific context for the physical abuse allegations. The financial fraud was proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but to grant the permanent restraining order and sever Nadine entirely from my life, the court required verified proof of the violence that initiated this entire chain of events. The trap was finally ready for the final, devastating blow. The judge's request for verified proof of the physical abuse hung in the cold, sterile air of the Polk County courtroom. Nadine sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly together over her oversized gray cardigan. She attempted to project the image of a deeply concerned caregiver, shaking her head slightly, offering the bench a look of wounded innocence. She believed she was entirely safe. She assumed the violence inflicted inside the walls of my childhood home would remain permanently hidden, reduced to a classic scenario involving a hysterical victim making unprovable claims against a devoted stepmother. Hector adjusted the microphone positioned on the witness stand. He did not mirror my stepmother's frantic emotional theater. He operated with the chilling, methodical precision of a veteran investigator closing a catastrophic claim. He directed the judge's attention back to the original emergency petition for adult conservatorship. He pointed out the specific legal mechanism Nadine had utilized to drag us into this municipal building. By attempting to strip my autonomy, Nadine had formally argued that I was physically unstable, prone to dangerous, erratic behavior, and completely incapable of safeguarding my own well-being. She claimed my clumsiness and frequent injuries required immediate, state-mandated supervision. My grandfather looked directly at the bench and explained the devastating legal irony of her strategy. By anchoring her entire lawsuit on the premise of my failing physical and mental health, Nadine had inadvertently dismantled her own privacy shields. She legally waived any evidentiary objections regarding my comprehensive medical history. She opened the door, and Hector was fully prepared to drive a freight train of authenticated science right through it. He opened the final ficus tab in his meticulously indexed binder. He extracted a dense stack of certified medical receipts and clinical charts originating from a local urgent care facility, dated the exact night I fled the farmhouse in the freezing rain. He submitted the documents to the bailiff, who carried them up to the heavy oak desk. Hector explained that he did not just pack my bags that evening. He recognized the severity of the situation immediately. Before we drove to his rural property, he took me straight to an all-night medical clinic to document the extensive trauma. Furthermore, he did not rely solely on the notes of an overworked triage nurse. My grandfather utilized his extensive professional net to secure a consultation with a retired county forensic pathologist. He handed over the resulting forensic report. The document was a masterpiece of cold, irrefutable biological science. The pathologist meticulously mapped the overlapping, multicolored contusions covering my shoulder spine and upper arms. The medical notes explicitly classified the injuries. They were not the result of clumsy accidental falls, as Nadine had so frequently claimed. The report categorized the trauma as classic, undeniable defensive wounds. The angle depth and specific distribution of the severe bruising perfectly aligned with blunt force trauma, consistent with being violently and deliberately shoved backward down a wooden staircase. The science confirmed that I had raised my arms to protect my head and neck from a forceful, malicious physical attack. Nadine's discount attorney attempted to object, half rising from his chair, stammering about relevance and hearsay. The judge silenced him instantly with a sharp warning glare. She adjusted her reading glasses and spent several agonizing minutes reading the forensic pathology report, line by line. The carefully constructed narrative of my fragile instability completely shattered against the bedrock of certified medical evidence. Nadine was no longer the exhausted, well-meaning guardian trying to protect a broken girl. The paperwork transformed her into a documented, violent abuser who had weaponized the legal system to trap her victim. The judge lowered the file, her expression hardening into a mask of absolute, unforgiving judicial disgust. She stared at Nadine with the kind of intense contempt reserved for predators who mistakenly believe they can manipulate the scales of justice. Nadine began to shake. The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion an ashen, sickly gray. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering frantically, desperately trying to construct a new lie to explain away the forensic reality. She was backed into a corner, her physical violence exposed in a public forum, but she still believed she could somehow salvage the financial empire she had stolen. Hector was not finished. He possessed one final, devastating revelation designed to obliterate the remaining foundations of her life. He pivoted his testimony away from the physical abuse and returned to the massive agricultural embezzlement scheme. He directed the court's attention back to Apex Holdings, the offshore shell company receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent United States Department of Agriculture green energy subsidies. My stepmother had assumed she was brilliantly insulated from the wire fraud. She believed the money trail terminated safely at her brother David Reed, who served as the registered agent for the corporation. She thought she could point the finger at him if the government ever initiated an audit. Hector pulled the official blue ink stamped incorporation documents from the state business registry. He explained that a registered agent simply handles administrative correspondence. The true legal vulnerability belongs to the sole proprietor listed on the operating agreement. The individual bearing the ultimate inescapable liability for the stolen federal funds, the massive tax evasion, and the documented wire fraud was not Nadine Perez. My grandfather read the name of the sole proprietor aloud, his voice echoing clearly across the silent courtroom. Britt Perez. Nadine had not just stolen my inheritance. She had deliberately and maliciously structured the illegal offshore entity using the social security number and personal identification of her own biological daughter. She had set her own flesh and blood up to take the catastrophic fall for a federal felony. She built a luxurious lifestyle using stolen money, and she ensured her own freedom by placing a target squarely on her child's back. A sharp, audible gasp ripped through the gallery. Britt was sitting in the second row, clutching a designer leather handbag purchased with the embezzled agricultural funds. She had come to the courthouse expecting to watch her mother secure a triumphant victory over me. Instead, she was watching her entire universe collapse. The blood vanished from Britt's face as the profound, horrifying reality of the betrayal crashed over her. She realized her mother had not provided her with a life of privilege out of love. Nadine had used her as a human shield. The commercial boutique lease, the expensive rental vehicles, the lavish vacations, they were all funded through a fraudulent enterprise bearing Britt's legal signature. If the federal government prosecuted the wire fraud, Nadine would claim ignorance and Britt would face decades in a federal penitentiary. The ultimate betrayal shattered the gallery's mandated silence. Britt sprang to her feet, her designer handbag crashing to the hardwood floor. She began screaming at her mother, her voice cracking with a mixture of absolute terror and profound rage. She demanded to know what Nadine had done, completely abandoning any pretense of familial solidarity. The discounted attorney threw his hands up in defeat, physically leaning away from his client as the toxic fallout threatened to contaminate his own legal standing. Nadine sat frozen, staring at her screaming daughter in abject horror. The narcissistic shield that had protected her for years finally cracked under the pressure of her own monstrous choices. She had sacrificed everyone, including her own child, to maintain her power, and now she was entirely surrounded by the wreckage. The judge brought her heavy wooden gavel down against the sounding block. The loud, sharp crack cut through the escalating chaos, silencing the screaming stepsister and restoring order to the municipal arena. The magistrate removed her reading glasses, her jaw set in a rigid, uncompromising line. The civil conservatorship hearing had officially reached a critical, irreversible threshold. The judge looked directly at the armed bailiff standing near the swinging wooden gate, issuing a chilling, authoritative directive that instantly transformed the entire landscape of our battle, shifting the momentum from a civil family dispute straight into the realm of a severe criminal indictment. The presiding magistrate adjusted her heavy black robes, her demeanor radiating absolute judicial fury. She leveled her gaze at the defense table, and the entire municipal arena fell into a deathly paralyzed silence. The chaotic echoes of the screaming stepsister faded away, replaced by the crushing gravity of a legal system that had just been weaponized and was now correcting its course with ruthless efficiency. The judge did not merely reject the emergency petition for adult conservatorship. She obliterated it with extreme prejudice. She dictated her ruling clearly for the court reporter, stating that the petitioner had presented fabricated medical narratives, manipulated psychological evaluations, and committed flagrant perjury in a brazen attempt to enslave an innocent family member. The magistrate formally struck the forged trust amendments from the county registry. With a few decisive sentences spoken into her microphone, she officially invalidated the quitclaim deed signed in Cedar Rapids. She restored my absolute bodily autonomy and legally reinstated me as the sole rightful and uncontested heir to the agricultural empire my father had built from the Iowa soil. But the civil restoration of my inheritance was only the beginning of the avalanche. The judge removed her reading glasses and pointed them directly at my stepmother. The atmosphere inside the room turned glacial. "You attempted to use this court as a weapon to cover your theft," the judge declared, her voice slicing through the heavy air like a sharpened blade. "This court bites back." She turned her attention to the primary court clerk seated below the bench. She instructed the clerk to immediately forward the entire evidentiary binder Hector had submitted to the local district attorney's white-collar crime division. Furthermore, Because the documented embezzlement involved federal green energy subsidies crossing state lines through complex shell corporations, the magistrate mandated a direct referral to the United States Department of Agriculture, Office of the Inspector General. The judge explained the catastrophic financial consequences of those referrals. Because the fraud demonstrated a coordinated, ongoing criminal enterprise utilizing offshore holding companies, the court was implementing an immediate, comprehensive asset freeze. She invoked the preliminary statutory mechanisms associated with the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The RICO freeze was instantaneous and merciless. Every single bank account associated with Nadine Perez, Britt Perez, and the Apex Holdings Shell Corporation was locked down by judicial decree. Their investment portfolios were suspended. Their credit cards were deactivated. The luxury vehicles parked outside, the designer wardrobes, the commercial boutique lease in downtown Des Moines, every single element of their stolen, opulent lifestyle evaporated in a matter of seconds. Nadine was stripped of her wealth faster than she could comprehend the loss. She had walked into the courthouse possessing the financial power to destroy my life, and she was going to walk out, completely destitute, unable to even purchase a cup of coffee. The magistrate struck her sounding block one final time. She ordered the armed bailiffs to take the petitioner into custody on an immediate detention hold, pending the arrival of the federal fraud investigators. Two broad-shouldered municipal deputies stepped forward from the shadows of the courtroom. They did not treat my stepmother with the gentle, deferential respect she believed her status commanded. They approached her with the brisk, clinical detachment reserved for common criminals. The discount attorney hastily pushed his chair away from the defense table, physically distancing himself from his radioactive client. One deputy grasped Nadine by her upper arm, hauling her out of her seat. The oversized gray cardigan she had worn to generate sympathy slipped off her shoulder, revealing the trembling, terrified woman underneath. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish. No manipulative lies could save her now. No amount of fake tears could override the certified blue ink stamps of the federal government. The deputy instructed her to place her hands behind her back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around her wrists echoed loudly throughout the gallery. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the auditory manifestation of absolute accountability. They marched her down the center aisle of the courtroom. Her posture was completely broken. Her expensive cream-colored designer shoes, still permanently stained with the dark black ink from her ruptured fountain pen, dragged across the linoleum floor. She looked utterly defeated, transformed from a terrifying domestic predator into a small, ruined inmate. As Nadine was escorted through the swinging wooden doors and out of sight, the reality of the situation crashed down upon her daughter. Britt collapsed onto the hard wooden bench in the spectator gallery. She buried her face in her hands, weeping with a chaotic, hysterical intensity. She was entirely alone. Her mother was heading to a federal holding cell. Her boutique business was dead. Her bank accounts were frozen by a federal mandate. Most terrifying of all, her legal signature was the sole authorization on the offshore LLC that received the embezzled government funds. Britt possessed no money to hire a criminal defense attorney, and she was currently staring down the barrel of a multi-count federal indictment that carried the potential for decades of mandatory incarceration. The luxurious, shielded reality she had enjoyed her entire life had been detonated, leaving her buried in the toxic fallout of her mother's greed. I remained seated at the plaintiff table. I did not turn around to gloat at my weeping stepsister. I did not jump up and down or cheer as the deputies hauled my abuser away in steel chains. I sat perfectly still, keeping my spine completely straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My breathing was slow, even, and profoundly calm. For 3 agonizing years, I had lived in a perpetual state of terror. I had hidden my bruises under thick sweatshirts, walking on eggshells in my own childhood home, praying that compliance would somehow purchase my safety. I had believed that because I was quiet, because I avoided screaming matches and physical confrontations, I was fundamentally weak and destined to be a victim. Sitting in that courtroom, watching the systemic destruction of the woman who tormented me, I finally understood the lesson my grandfather had traveled through a blizzard to teach me. True power does not require a raised voice. It does not require emotional hysterics, public meltdowns, or violent intimidation. The most devastating weapon a person can wield is the cold, calculated application of the truth. I had not yelled a single insult. I had not broken down into tears on the witness stand. I had simply maintained my composure, gathered the receipts, and watched certified, unalterable paper execute a level of total devastation that screaming never could achieve. Hector closed his massive, meticulously indexed binder. He patted the battered leather cover with a deep sense of satisfaction. He leaned over, placing his warm, calloused hand over my knuckles. He offered a small, proud smile that crinkled the corners of his weathered eyes. We had won the war, and we had done it exactly according to his rules. We gathered our coats and walked out of the municipal building, stepping through the heavy glass doors into the bright, piercing sunlight of the Iowa afternoon. The freezing ice storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, brilliant blue sky and a landscape glittering with frozen crystals. The air felt incredibly crisp and clean in my lungs. However, as we walked across the icy parking lot toward his heavy-duty pickup truck, the adrenaline that had fueled my composure began to recede, revealing a massive, looming logistical nightmare. The judge had rightfully frozen the entire Perez operational trust to prevent any further embezzlement while the federal agents conducted their forensic audit. That sweeping judicial injunction meant that while I was legally reinstated as the sole owner of the 500-acre agricultural estate, the liquid cash required to actually operate the property remained locked behind a federal bureaucratic wall. I stopped walking, my hand resting on the frozen metal door handle of the truck. I looked at my grandfather, realizing the immediate, terrifying reality of our victory. Nadine was sitting in a jail cell, but her physical belongings, her furniture, and the lingering, suffocating memories of her abuse still completely occupied my childhood home. We needed to return to the farmhouse to reclaim the property, but the estate accounts were entirely inaccessible. We possessed exactly 0 liquid funds to hire a locksmith, pay the outstanding utility bills Nadine had undoubtedly neglected, or hire a crew to remove her contaminated possessions from my sanctuary. We had successfully conquered the legal battlefield, but I was now facing the monumental, terrifying task of walking back into the physical crime scene of my trauma without a single penny to secure the perimeter before nightfall. I stood frozen beside the passenger door of my grandfather's heavy-duty pickup truck, the sharp reality of our judicial victory suddenly colliding with the overwhelming logistical nightmare of a federal asset freeze. The Polk County magistrate had rightfully locked down every single bank account associated with the Perez Operational Trust to preserve the remaining agricultural wealth. That meant the liquid capital required to function on a daily basis was trapped behind an impenetrable wall of government bureaucracy. I stared at the icy asphalt, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Nadine was sitting in a municipal holding cell, but her physical possessions, her oppressive furniture, and the lingering ghosts of her psychological torment still completely dominated my childhood home. We needed to return to the farmhouse immediately to secure the perimeter, but I possessed absolutely 0 cash to hire a professional locksmith, pay the outstanding utility bills, or fund the massive physical cleanout my sanctuary desperately required. Hector watched the panic wash over my face. He did not mirror my anxiety. Instead, a slow, deeply reassuring smile spread across his weathered features. He reached his large, calloused hand inside the interior breast pocket of his heavy winter coat. He withdrew a thick, unsealed bank envelope and handed it to me across the freezing wind. I opened the flap and found a substantial stack of crisp, neatly banded $100 bills, accompanied by a certified cashier's check drawn directly from his personal retirement savings account. My grandfather explained that he had spent over 3 decades working in the meticulous, highly regulated world of agricultural insurance adjusting. He knew exactly how the federal government operated when a wire fraud indictment involved complex offshore holding companies. He anticipated the immediate RICO freeze the moment he uncovered the fake soybean subsidies. He knew the court would lock the estate down tight, and he had deliberately liquidated a portion of his own secure assets to float my living expenses, hire a legal team to untangle the bureaucratic mess, and fund the complete restoration of our family property. He told me that a good investigator never simply plans for the confrontation. A good investigator always plans for the morning after the victory. The crushing weight of the logistical crisis evaporated, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. I climbed into the warm cabin of the truck, clutching the envelope to my chest, finally understanding that I was entirely safe. We drove back to the farmhouse that exact same afternoon. Our first stop was the local hardware store, where Hector purchased 4 heavy-duty industrial-grade deadbolts. We did not wait for a professional contractor. My grandfather retrieved his heavy steel toolbox from the truck bed, and we systematically replaced every single exterior lock on the property. When the final brass strike plate was secured into the wooden doorframe, the satisfying, heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place felt like the ultimate declaration of independence. Walking through the front door felt remarkably different than it had just 3 days prior. The suffocating atmosphere of terror had vanished. Nadine had filled the house with incredibly gaudy, expensive decor, attempting to erase my father's rustic, comfortable aesthetic. She had draped heavy velvet curtains over the large windows, blocking out the natural Iowa sunlight. She had placed fragile, overpriced crystal vases on every available surface, turning a working farmhouse into a sterile, intimidating museum. Before the courthouse showdown, those objects represented her absolute control. Now, looking at the oppressive furniture and the ridiculous velvet curtains, I realized they were just meaningless items purchased with stolen money. They held absolutely no power over me anymore. Hector and I spent the entire weekend methodically bagging up every single designer garment, every expensive pair of ink-stained shoes, and every piece of unnecessary clutter. We dragged heavy black trash bags out to a massive steel dumpster in the driveway, executing a complete physical and architectural exorcism of my childhood home. 6 months passed, and the dust from the legal explosion finally settled over the rolling green acres of the Perez estate. The federal investigation was swift, merciless, and completely undeniable. When the agents from the United States Department of Agriculture cross-referenced Nadine's sworn financial disclosure affidavits with the fraudulent green energy grants, the criminal exposure was too massive for any defense attorney to mitigate. Facing the terrifying prospect of decades in a maximum security penitentiary, my stepmother ultimately accepted a heavily structured plea agreement. She formally confessed to multiple counts of federal wire fraud, systemic embezzlement, and felony perjury. Nadine is currently residing in a federal correctional institution located 3 states away. She wears a standard-issue uniform, adheres to a strict daily schedule dictated by prison guards, and possesses absolutely zero control over her environment. The woman who once demanded unquestioning obedience and terrorized me over misplaced household items is now spending her days scrubbing cafeteria trays for pennies an hour. Britt did not escape the catastrophic fallout. Because her legal signature authorized the offshore shell corporation, she barely avoided her own federal indictment by agreeing to cooperate fully with the government prosecutors and testifying against her mother. However, the asset freeze completely decimated her luxurious reality. Without the stolen agricultural funds to pay her exorbitant commercial lease, her downtown boutique went bankrupt in a matter of weeks. Her expensive rental cars were repossessed. Cut off entirely from the Perez wealth, Britt is currently working a minimum wage retail job at a suburban shopping mall, learning the harsh, unforgiving reality of actually having to earn a living without a stolen safety net. I have reclaimed my life entirely. I returned to my position as a veterinary technician at the local clinic in Des Moines, but I no longer shrink away from my coworkers or hide beneath oversized, heavy sweatshirts. I stand with my shoulders pulled back, confident and entirely unburdened. The legal team, funded by Hector, successfully untangled the bureaucratic labyrinth of the trust, permanently lifting the asset freeze and officially transferring the liquid capital back into my secure, verified accounts. It was a remarkably warm, beautiful summer afternoon in Iowa. The sky was a brilliant, vibrant blue, and the endless rows of healthy crops swayed gently in the warm Midwestern breeze. I sat on the wide wraparound wooden porch of the farmhouse, holding a tall glass of sweet iced tea. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and rich, fertile soil. Inside the main foyer, a professional contractor was currently standing on a tall aluminum ladder. He was carefully dismantling the massive, incredibly gaudy crystal chandelier Nadine had installed using my stolen inheritance. I watched with immense satisfaction as the heavy glass fixtures were lowered to the floor and packed away into cardboard boxes. In its place, the contractor was installing the original, rustic wooden ceiling fan that my father Reuben had loved so dearly. The gentle, rhythmic hum of the wooden blades spinning overhead felt like the final, definitive heartbeat of the house, being restored to its rightful rhythm. Hector walked up the porch steps, his heavy work boots thudding softly against the wooden floorboards. He took a seat in the woven rocking chair beside me, accepting a glass of cold iced tea. He leaned back, letting the warm summer breeze wash over his face. He looked at me, his sharp, observant eyes scanning my posture. He rested his gaze momentarily on my exposed shoulder, completely free of any dark, mottled bruising. The skin was clear, healthy, and entirely healed. "We did not just survive her, Grandpa," I said quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sprawling agricultural fields met the bright sky. "I survived her for 3 years. Survival is just enduring the damage and hoping the storm eventually passes. What we did in that courthouse was something completely different." Hector took a slow, deliberate sip of his iced tea. He looked out over the rolling green Iowa farmland that was finally safe, legally secured, and completely free from the toxic grasp of domestic predators. He set his glass down on the small wooden side table and offered me a gentle, profoundly proud smile. "No, Gracie," my grandfather replied, his voice steady, calm, and carrying the quiet authority of a man who knew the absolute value of the truth. "We audited her." I leaned back in my chair, listening to the rustic ceiling fan humming in the foyer and the wind rustling through the tall green stalks of the fields. The nightmare was officially over, eradicated not by matching the volume of an abuser, but by mastering the cold, undeniable power of documentation. If you are currently sitting in the dark, paying the emotional rent for someone else's fabricated reality, you must understand that the price of their comfort will never stop rising. The people who demand your silence are relying on your fear to maintain their illusions. You do not need to scream to dismantle their power. You do not need to throw a massive tantrum to prove your worth. You simply need to step back, gather the receipts, establish an unshakable boundary, and let the paperwork do the talking. Paper never panics. Paper never forgets. And when the absolute truth finally arrives, paper always collects the debt. The myth of the American farmhouse is deeply woven into our cultural fabric. We are raised to believe that these spaces, with their wraparound porches, rustic ceiling fans, and vast rolling acres, are inherent sanctuaries. They are supposed to be bastions of traditional family values, places where honesty is harvested alongside the crops, and where children are guided by the steady moral hands of their elders. But as the quiet, devastating triumph of Esther Perez proves, a home does not automatically generate safety just because it has a picket fence. When a family's foundation is stripped of emotional awareness and fairness, the dinner table can quickly become the most dangerous room in the house. Reflecting on the fallout of the Perez estate, we are forced to confront a profoundly uncomfortable truth about parenting, family responsibility, and what we are truly handing down to the next generation. In modern society, there is a dangerous misconception that providing for a child materially is the ultimate expression of parental love. Nadine, in her twisted psychological framework, likely believed she was an exceptional mother to her biological daughter, Britt. She secured commercial boutique leases, funded expensive rental cars, and curated a life of absolute luxury, shielding Britt from the harsh, character-building realities of failure and hard work. But true family responsibility is not about sheltering children from the world. It is about equipping them with the moral compass to navigate it. Nadine stripped her daughter of accountability, replacing honesty with entitlement. And the tragic irony is that in her desperate bid to provide a flawless, opulent life for Britt, Nadine committed the ultimate parental betrayal. She used her own child as a human shield by placing Britt's name on the fraudulent offshore LLC. Nadine proved that toxic parenting does not always look like neglect. Sometimes it looks like overwhelming indulgence funded by catastrophic deceit. When we raise children without fairness, when we teach them that they are above the rules, that they can extract wealth from others without consequence, we are not protecting them. We are building the very prison they will eventually inhabit. Britt was left weeping in a courtroom gallery, completely broken and facing federal indictment. Not because she was unloved, but because she was loved incorrectly. She was raised in a system that valued the aesthetics of success over the ethics of how it was achieved. Contrast this tragic failure with the profound, enduring strength of Hector. He represents the true bedrock of traditional American family values, the kind of parenting and grandparenting that relies on acute observation, unyielding fairness, and a deep, quiet emotional awareness. Hector did not need to shout to establish his authority. When he saw the terrifying mottled bruises on Esther's shoulder, his reaction was a masterclass in protective guidance. In a culture that often equates loud, aggressive outrage with love, Hector chose a different path. He did not storm upstairs and engage in a screaming match with an irrational abuser. He did not let emotion cloud his judgment. Instead, he recognized that true protection requires strategy. He handed Esther a duffel bag, took her to a forensic pathologist, and taught her the most vital lesson a parent or guardian can impart. You do not defeat monsters by matching their chaos. You defeat them by documenting their reality. This is the essence of long-term guidance. Raising children within a traditional family structure is not about demanding blind obedience or forcing them to keep toxic peace for the sake of appearances. It is about teaching them resilience. It is about showing them that their bodily autonomy and their mental peace are sacred, and that they possess the intrinsic right to defend those boundaries. Hector equipped Esther not with vengeance, but with a ledger. He taught her that paper never panics, and that the truth, when meticulously recorded, is an unstoppable force. Peeling back the polite, curated wallpaper of family dynamics to reveal the structural beams underneath is not easy, but it is necessary work. It requires us to look honestly at our own households and ask hard questions about the values we are truly modeling for our children. If you find yourself resonating with Esther's quiet survival, if you've ever had to unlearn the toxic scripts handed to you by the people who were supposed to protect you, or if you simply believe in the power of calm, methodical justice, I encourage you to follow Zara Told Stories. On this channel, we share the narratives of those who stopped screaming and started auditing. We explore the profound, often hidden mechanics of family trauma and the beautiful, quiet power of reclaiming your life. Subscribe and join a community that values the cold, hard truth over comfortable fictions. We are taught from a very young age to keep the peace. Conventional wisdom tells us that family is a bond that must withstand any offense, that forgiveness is the highest virtue a child can learn, and that maintaining the image of a unified home is worth swallowing our pain. We are conditioned to believe that blood is thicker than water, and that true grace means turning the other cheek when those closest to us strike it. But Esther's survival demands that we reject this conventional wisdom entirely. Forgiveness without accountability is not grace. It is a hostage situation. Teaching a child to endlessly forgive an abuser simply because they share a roof or a bloodline does not make them morally superior. It makes them prey. The ultimate philosophical lesson of the Perez family is that we must stop raising our children to be accommodating victims in the name of familial loyalty. We must stop teaching them to bury their bruises for the comfort of the collective. Instead, we must raise them to be auditors of their own lives. We must teach them that respect is a contract, love is an action, and trust requires receipts. When you sit at your own dining table looking across at the family you have built, you must remember that the peace in your home is only as real as the honesty that sustains it. You can build the most beautiful farmhouse, curate the most perfect holiday photos, and project an image of absolute traditional stability, but in the end, the most terrifying, ambiguous question isn't whether you have successfully shielded your children from the wolves in the outside world. The question is when the house goes quiet and the doors are locked. Are your children secretly keeping a ledger on you